Hey guys, tonight we're climbing aboard a ship where the captain can be voted out before lunch, where losing an eye is worth more money than losing a toe, and where the fastest way to end up marooned on a sandbar isn't disobeying an order, it's stealing so much as a shilling from your own crew. Forget the eye patch and parrot version of pirate life for a moment. What actually held these ships together was closer to a contract than a costume, a written charter, a democratic vote, and a compensation schedule for battle injuries that wouldn't look wildly out of place next to a modern insurance policy. Aboard Bartholomew Roberts' ship Royal Fortune in 1721, that contract governed a crew that, at its largest, numbered in the hundreds. Men who elected their own captain and could remove him by majority vote before the anchor was even up. Welcome to the strange, surprisingly orderly machinery that ran a pirate ship, the part the movies never show you. Dim the lights, if you haven't already. Let a fan hum in the background, if you'd like something to listen to. Low and steady, close enough to the sound of wind pushing through rigging and canvas a few hundred miles from land. You're warm right now. Dry, still, that won't be true where we're going. So get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Into the ropes, the votes and the ledgers that actually ran a pirate ship. The smell reaches you before the ship does. Tar and gun smoke and something under it. Salt gone sour with too many bodies in too little space. It's a Tuesday morning in the Caribbean, some year in the early 1720s, and your merchant sloop has just been run down by a ship flying no flag at all, which is somehow worse than one flying a black one. Grappling hooks bite into your rail. Men come over the side faster than you can count them, cutlasses out, and your first thought, the mundane comforting one, is that this will be quick. They'll take the cargo, maybe your good boots, and let you row home with a story to dine out on for years. That is not what happens. What happens is that you and the rest of the merchant crew are lined up on your own deck, while a man with a ledger under his arm walks the row like he's inspecting livestock. Which, in a sense, he is. He isn't looking for money. He's looking for skills, a carpenter, a surgeon, anyone who can read a chart or splice a line cleanly enough to trust with it. This is the first thing the movies get wrong. Most pirate crews weren't kidnapping random sailors for sport. They were recruiting, and recruiting under duress was simply how the market worked when the honest one paid so badly. Next to you, a young sailmaker named Josiah Barrow, maybe 19, hands already scarred from needle pricks, mutters that he'd rather drown than sign anything. He'll say something very different in about 6 weeks. For now, the ledger man stops in front of you and asks the question the whole morning has been building to: are you willing? Here's the thing about that question. It mattered more than you'd think, and pirate crews of this era went out of their way to have witnesses to the answer. A man who signed the ship's articles freely was a pirate under the law of the time, fully liable to hang for it. A man who could prove later in an admiralty court that he'd been forced, dragged aboard, refused permission to leave at the next port, never given a genuine vote, had a real legal argument to save his neck. Which is exactly why some crews, including men serving under Bartholomew Roberts, made a formal show of writing forced next to certain names in the ship's book, a kind of pre-emptive alibi entered into the official record while the ink was still wet. It sounds almost considerate. It wasn't, particularly. It was bookkeeping, done by men who fully expected to be tried one day and wanted their crewmates' testimony on record before memories got fuzzy. Roughly a third of any given pirate crew, by some estimates drawn from trial depositions of the period, may have started out exactly this way. Pressed, not persuaded. You say yes. Not because you want to, because the alternative, standing on this deck refusing while 40 armed men wait for your answer, doesn't feel like an alternative at all. Josiah says yes too, eventually, after a pause that goes on a beat too long. The pirate quartermaster, you'll learn that word soon, and what it means, and that it matters more than captain does most days, makes a small mark next to both your names. Welcome aboard. Nobody says it kindly, but nobody says it cruelly either. It's just recorded, the way a birth or a debt gets recorded. You have, in the space of about 11 minutes, changed careers. By that evening, you're standing on the pirate ship's own deck for the reading of the articles, and this is where the morning's chaos gives way to something you did not expect at all: procedure. The quartermaster, a wiry man named Silas Rowe, who you'll come to know rather well over the following weeks, produces a folded, salt-stiffened sheet covered in close handwriting and reads it aloud, slowly, for the benefit of the men aboard who can't read it themselves, which by some accounts was most of them. This is the ship's articles, a written constitution, drawn up and agreed to by the crew that formed the ship's company, governing everything from how prizes get divided to what happens if you strike a crewmate in anger. Surviving examples exist because they occasionally turned up as evidence at trials. The fullest and best documented set comes from Bartholomew Roberts' own ship, preserved because a captured crewman handed a copy over during questioning in 1721, and it reads less like a pirate legend and more like a workplace handbook with unusually severe penalties. The rules themselves are almost aggressively mundane, which is precisely what makes them strange. No gambling for money or dice aboard, lights and candles to be put out at 8 in the evening, and any man wanting to drink past that hour is to do it on the open deck, in the dark, not below among the powder. Every man's weapon, pistol, cutlass, to be kept clean and ready for service, on pain of being cut off from his share of the plunder if he lets it rust. No striking another man aboard ship. Disputes are to be settled on land, with pistol and sword under the eye of the quartermaster acting as referee, rather than left to fester below decks, where a grudge could sour the whole crew. And, in Robert's articles specifically, no woman to be brought aboard in disguise, on pain of death, a rule that existed less out of superstition. Historians generally argue than out of a blunt calculation that jealousy and secrecy were the fastest ways to destroy the fragile trust an armed crew of several hundred men depended on to not turn on each other. You expected chaos. You got bylaws. Somewhere in the crowd, Josiah leans over and whispers that this is, and I quote him loosely here, the most organised robbery I've ever heard read aloud. Nobody laughs, exactly, but a few men nod. And here's the detail that should unsettle you more than any of the violence you've seen today. Every man present has to put his hand to this document, sign it, or make his mark if he can't write, before the ship sails again. Not because anyone doubts your loyalty yet, because a contract with no signature is just an argument waiting to happen, and out here, arguments get settled with steel. 3 days out from that first evening, you assume someone is obviously in charge, a captain, standing on the quarterdeck barking orders the way you've seen on every merchant ship you've ever served. And there is a captain. What surprises you is watching how he got there, and how thin his authority actually runs once you understand the machine underneath it. The captain of a pirate ship, on most crews of this period, was elected, a straightforward show of hands or voices, 1 man, 1 vote, powder monkey and gunner counted the same as any officer. No property requirement, no rank held over from the navy, no inherited command. If the current captain hasn't been captured in a prize taken that week, this vote won't happen today. But it could happen tomorrow, and everyone aboard knows it, which changes how a captain behaves in ways a king never has to consider. Here's the twist that took you longest to understand. The captain's power was almost entirely conditional. In battle, or in the chase of a prize, his word was law. Total, immediate, unquestioned. Because a ship fighting by committee gets everyone killed. The moment the fighting stopped, though, his authority shrank down to roughly the size of everyone else's. And most of the actual day-to-day running of the ship, the food, the discipline, the division of stolen goods, the settling of quarrels, fell to a different officer entirely. The quartermaster, elected separately and answering, in some real sense, more directly to the crew than the captain did. It's a split you don't see anywhere else at sea in this era. A wartime autocrat and a peacetime steward, both accountable to the same voting body, both removable by it, And removable is not a figure of speech. A captain who proved a coward in a fight, who hoarded plunder, who was cruel without cause, cruelty with cause being, grimly, a separate category entirely, could be and was voted out. It happened often enough that it wasn't scandalous when it did, it was simply the system working as designed. You'll hear a specific, well-documented version of exactly this story later. A captain deposed mid-voyage, replaced within the hour, the ship never missing a tide. For now, on your third day aboard, all you know is that the man currently barking orders from the quarterdeck got there by vote, and could lose the post the same way. Somewhere in you, against every instinct from your old merchant ship life, a small and unfamiliar thought takes root. This is, in its own violent fashion, more say than you ever had over who commanded you before. A week in, Silas Rowe finds you mending a line and, unprompted, walks you through the part of the articles you'd skimmed past on the night of the reading, the part about what happens to your body if this goes wrong. It reads, in the version you signed, almost like a price list. Loss of a right arm, 800 pieces of 8, or 8 enslaved people awarded from the value of a prize, depending on the crew and the year. Historians note the value was sometimes reckoned in captives taken from other vessels, an ugly detail of the era that the romantic pirate story tends to leave out entirely. Loss of a left arm or a leg valued somewhat less, loss of an eye or a finger less again, but never nothing. This isn't kindness exactly. It's closer to what a modern worker would recognise as a workers' compensation schedule drawn up by men who understood, with total clarity, that the whole enterprise depended on convincing frightened new recruits like you that a maiming wouldn't simply end in you being put ashore penniless. You ask Silas the obvious question, who pays it, in the end when a man's whole body is worth this much less than his life was a moment before? He explains that it comes off the top, before the shares are divided, money set aside deliberately from the common stock specifically for this purpose, the same way a prize's food and repair costs get settled before anyone's individual cut is counted out at all. It's not charity from the captain's pocket. It's insurance, funded collectively, guaranteed by the same document that governs the gambling rules and the candle snuffing hour. No naval sailor of your former acquaintance had anything like it. A man maimed in service to the crown might get a pension, eventually, if he survived the paperwork, which many didn't. Josiah, listening nearby, asks Silas how he knows the payout is honoured, and not just a nice sentence written on a page somewhere. Silas's answer sticks with you for the rest of the voyage, because the crew that doesn't honour it stops getting new hands to sign, and word travels fast between crews that share the same ports, the same taverns, the same understanding of how this life is supposed to work. Reputation, in other words, is the enforcement mechanism. No court of law is coming to garnish anyone's share for cheating a wounded shipmate. The only court that matters is the one made up of the men standing on this deck, and their memory is long. It's not romantic, it's just, again, oddly practical, a system built by men with no state to appeal to. So they built the appeal into each other instead. By your second prize taken, a Dutch flag trader run down off a coastline you don't yet know the name of, you learn the part of the system that most disappoints you. The shares aren't equal, no matter what the recruiting pitch implied back on your old ship's deck. Under the articles you signed, the captain and quartermaster draw something in the range of 1.5 to 2 full shares apiece. Officers like the master gunner and boatswain draw a share and a quarter, and ordinary hands like you and Josiah draw 1 whole share each, better in absolute terms than almost any wage a merchant sailor could hope for, but not the flat romantic equality the word brotherhood might suggest. What it is instead is proportional, a system that pays extra for extra responsibility, decided in advance, written down, agreed to by vote, before anyone knew whether this particular voyage would yield anything at all. And that last part is its own rule, one Silas mentions almost in passing, because to him it's too obvious to dwell on: no prey, no pay. If the ship takes no prizes, nobody gets a share of anything, officers included. It's the flip side of the wage system you left behind, no guaranteed pay, but also no captain skimming a fortune off the top, while the crew starves on rations. The risk is shared as visibly as the reward is, which is precisely the point. What surprises you most, watching the actual counting happen on deck, canvas laid out, coin and goods sorted into careful piles under Silas's steady supervision, while men who can barely read watch every motion of his hands like hawks, is how little anyone seems to trust the process to run itself, and how much faith they put, instead, in watching it happen in the open where every man present can object. There's no captain's cabin where the money vanishes to be tallied in private. It happens here, on deck, in daylight, with every man present entitled to object. You think, not for the first time this week, of every merchant voyage you signed onto before this one, where the owner's account book was a closed thing you never once laid eyes on. Here, at least, you get to watch them count. 3 weeks out of your last port, you watch the darker side of the same system play out. And it changes how you think about the word articles for good. A crewman named Rafferty, older than you, quieter than you'd expect from a man in this line of work, is caught with a handful of coin he didn't declare at the counting, tucked inside a rolled stocking in his sea chest. Under the articles every man aboard signed. Theft from the common stock is one of the small handful of offences that can carry a death sentence outright, but in practice, on most crews, the more common punishment for a first offence like this was marooning, put ashore on some spit of sand or scrub island with a pistol, a little shot and powder, a bottle of water, and left there. Not always fatal, sometimes another ship happened by. Often, nobody ever heard from the man again, and the crew simply moved on without discussing it further. What strikes you isn't the harshness. Merchant captains flogged men for less and answered to nobody for it. What strikes you is that Rafferty gets a hearing. Not a lengthy one, not a lawyer's version of due process, but a real one. The quartermaster lays out what was found. Rafferty is allowed to speak, and then the crew, not the captain alone, votes on what happens to him. It passes for marooning rather than hanging, by what looks to you like a fairly close margin. You don't know if that's mercy or just an even split of opinion breaking the way it did. Either way, the vote itself is the point, on your old ship. An accusation like this ended with the captain's word and a rope, full stop. Here it ends with dozens of men who have their own reasons to fear the same accusation someday, deciding together how much mercy the system can afford to extend without falling apart. Josiah doesn't speak for the rest of that day. Neither, honestly, do you. 6 weeks in, it's Josiah's hand that gets caught between a block and the mainmast during a squall, a moment that takes less time to happen than it takes to describe, a snap of rope under strain, a shout, and then Josiah is on the deck holding his hand against his chest, 2 fingers ruined beyond saving. The ship's surgeon, a man who was himself a forced recruit from a captured naval vessel 2 years earlier and never left, does what he can with what he has, which by the standards of 1720s medicine is genuinely more than you'd expect. Pirate crews, oddly, often paid a premium specifically to keep a trained surgeon aboard, sometimes offering a flat bonus of 100 or more pieces of 8 on top of a full share. Precisely because everyone understood how often this exact scene repeated itself. What happens after is the part that catches you off guard. Silas doesn't wait for the next full counting to settle Josiah's claim. Within a day, working from the same schedule you learnt about weeks earlier, he tallies out Josiah's compensation for the injury against the ship's common stock. Right there, in front of witnesses, the way every other transaction on this ship happens, not because Josiah demanded it, but because the articles say it's owed, and the crew, including you, would notice if it wasn't paid. It isn't a fortune. It won't undo the 2 fingers he's lost, or the fact that a sailmaker with a ruined hand has a harder road ahead than most. But it is real money, real fast, handed over without argument, and you watch something in Josiah's face settle in a way it hasn't since the morning you were both taken. He tells you, quietly, later, that no merchant captain he ever sailed under would have done as much as walk to his hammock to ask how he was. You don't romanticize it. A man's hand is still a man's hand, and no ledger entry gives it back. But you notice, filing it away with everything else you've learnt this month, that the thing binding this crew together isn't affection, exactly. It's the fact that every man aboard has watched the system pay out when it was owed, and every man aboard needs to believe it'll do the same for him. By the time the ship is careened for the first time under your feet, hauled over on a deserted beach, hull scraped free of the weed and barnacles that can slow a ship enough to turn a chase into a funeral, you've settled into the rhythm of watches and votes enough that it no longer feels like a novelty. You've learned that the boatswain, the master gunner, even the ship's cook in some crews, are elected posts too, not appointments, which means you've now voted more times in 6 weeks aboard a pirate ship than you did in your entire life on land, where such decisions were made by men you never met and never chose. There's a dry joke Silas makes once, watching a fresh vote on who should replace an injured gunner's mate, that pirate ships hold more elections in a season than most English boroughs manage in a decade. Technically true, and not nearly as funny as he thinks it is, but you laugh anyway, because by now you've learnt that's part of the job too. What happens below decks after a good haul, when the rum comes out and the fiddler who signed on back in Nassau finally gets to play something other than a work shanty, is a different matter, and not one this chapter has time for tonight. For now, all that matters is where you stand, signed, sworn, voted in on 3 separate occasions this month alone, and further from the man who stood shivering on his own captured deck a few weeks ago than you'd have thought possible. Within a year of signing the articles, if you live that long, and by some grim estimates drawn from the era's trial records, plenty didn't, whether to disease, drowning, or the gallows waiting in Newport or Charlestown or Cape Coast Castle, you'll understand the whole shape of the thing you joined in a way you couldn't on day one. It wasn't a gang in the way the word suggests to modern ears. No boss, no soldiers, no chain of command running upward to someone untouchable. It was closer to a floating, heavily armed cooperative, held together by a document every man had a hand in agreeing to, enforced not by a distant king's law, but by the plain fact that everyone aboard needed everyone else to keep believing in it. Silas Rowe still checks the weapons every Sunday, the way the articles require. Josiah still mends sail, slower now, with 8 fingers instead of 10, drawing his full share regardless. And you, forced aboard 11 minutes into a Tuesday morning that feels like a lifetime ago, have become, whether you meant to or not, exactly the kind of man that Ledgerkeeper was looking for that first day, someone the system could rely on. That system, though, had a name for the man who actually ran it day to day, and it wasn't the captain. It's time you met him properly. That system had a title for the man who actually ran it, and understanding him means starting not aboard a ship, but on a beach, Principe Island, off the coast of West Africa, June of 1719. The pirate captain Howell Davis has come ashore under a flag of truce, invited by the Portuguese governor for what was supposed to be a friendly dinner, a courtesy visit between a man who ran an island and a man who currently ran the sea around it. It's an ambush. Portuguese soldiers open fire from cover, and Davis goes down before he can so much as draw a pistol, killed within sight of his own ship. What happens in the next hour, back aboard that ship, is the part of the story that matters here, because the crew doesn't fall apart. It doesn't dissolve into panicked infighting over who leads next. It holds an election, on the spot, with the same procedural calm the men would have used to vote on a Sunday's rum ration. And the man who runs that vote, who counts the hands raised and certifies the result, isn't the captain. There isn't one anymore. It's the quartermaster, and he is, in every practical sense that matters to the 80-odd men on that deck, more important to the ship's survival in this exact moment than the captain ever was. The office of quartermaster didn't originate with pirates. It was borrowed, like so much of pirate practice, from the legitimate world of English privateering and merchant shipping, where a quartermaster handled stores, provisions, and the practical logistics of keeping a vessel fed and supplied. Pirate crews took that administrative title and grafted onto it something closer to a constitutional office, part logistics manager, part shop steward, part judge, where the captain's authority spiked during battle and nearly vanished the rest of the time, the quartermasters ran the opposite way. Steady, constant, and in many crews, genuinely more feared day to day than the captains. He distributed food. He settled quarrels before they turned to blades. He administered lesser punishments under the ship's articles, freeing the captain from having to personally flog or maroon men he'd need to trust again in the next engagement. In the account historians rely on most for this period, Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates, a book whose authorship is genuinely disputed and whose details are known to have been dramatised in places, the quartermaster is repeatedly described as the crew's chosen check against a captain who might otherwise abuse the near-absolute power battle temporarily handed him. Whatever the book gets wrong about specific dialogue, the underlying structure it describes matches what survives in trial depositions and captured articles closely enough that historians take the broad shape seriously, even while treating individual quotes with real caution. This is the story of that office, the second in command who for days or weeks at a stretch was really the first, told through one man who held it, rose because of it, and was ultimately undone by exactly the kind of unchecked opportunity it was designed to prevent. Walter Kennedy was, by his own later account, an unlikely candidate for any position of trust. Illiterate by most reckonings, a detail that becomes almost darkly comic later in this story, and previously employed as a common sailor and, according to some records, briefly as a burglar in London before he ever went to sea. Kennedy joined the crew that would eventually serve under Howell Davis through the same rough process described earlier: a captured vessel, an offer, a signature he likely couldn't read but understood well enough to make his mark on. What got him noticed wasn't charm. By most surviving descriptions, he had little of it. What got him noticed was a kind of blunt reliability in a fight, and a willingness to enforce the crew's collective decisions without personal grudge, which, on a ship where everyone's survival depended on everyone else honouring the same rules, turned out to be worth more than charisma. When the crew held that election on Principe's waters, the immediate choice for captain fell to Bartholomew Roberts, a Welsh sailing master who'd been aboard barely 6 weeks, forced like so many others, and who by most accounts wanted the job about as much as he wanted a return bout of the fever going around the lower deck. According to Johnson's often embellished account, Roberts accepted with a resigned line to the effect that having already gone this far into dangerous water, he might as well be the one steering it, a sentiment that, embellished or not, matches the practical reality facing any forced man who'd already signed the articles and had nothing left to lose by leadership. Kennedy, in the same round of voting, was confirmed or elevated into the quartermaster's role. Accounts differ on the precise mechanics, and this is one of the places the record simply thins out. But what's clear is that within this single reshuffling of command, 2 very different men ended up running the same ship: a reluctant, disciplined, famously abstemious captain in Roberts, who by multiple accounts drank tea rather than rum and insisted on strict order, and a rougher, more populist quartermaster in Kennedy, whose job was to keep several hundred armed men fed, paid fairly, and disinclined to mutiny. That's worth pausing on how strange this pairing actually was for its time, and it deserves a moment's real reflection rather than a quick nod in passing. Nowhere else at sea in 1719, not in the Royal Navy, not aboard any East India Company vessel, did a crew get to formally check its captain's authority through a second, independently elected officer with real teeth. A naval captain who starved his crew or punished them arbitrarily answered eventually to an admiralty court an ocean away, if he answered at all. A pirate captain who did the same answered to Kennedy, standing on the same deck, backed by a crew that had voted him into exactly this position for exactly this purpose. Kennedy's daily work, once he held the post, would look almost tediously bureaucratic if it weren't happening on a heavily armed ship in pirate-infested waters that were, somewhat confusingly, also his own workplace. He kept the ship's common stock, food, drink, captured goods not yet divided, and rationed it out according to the articles, resisting, at least in the surviving picture of his tenure, the obvious temptation to favour his own mess over anyone else's. He arbitrated the small disputes that could otherwise fester. two men arguing over a hammock, a claim that someone had shorted another man's share of tobacco, the everyday friction of several hundred men living on top of each other for months, and he presided in the absence of the captain over punishments for lesser offences under the Articles, doling out the kind of discipline that kept the ship functioning without requiring Roberts to personally play executioner every time a rule got bent. What made this work more than any formal power written into the Articles was something closer to reputation management. A quartermaster who played favourites, who shorted the crew to line his own pockets, wouldn't survive the next vote, and everyone aboard, Kennedy included, knew it. So he by most accounts erred towards scrupulous, almost theatrical fairness, dividing plunder in front of witnesses, settling disputes with visible even-handedness, making sure the newest forced hand got exactly the same ration as the oldest volunteer. It's the pirate version of a manager who leaves his office door open at all times, not out of warmth, but because a closed door invites suspicion he can't afford. There's a smaller, quieter detail from this period of Kennedy's service that's easy to miss. Several of the men under his watch during this stretch were, per later trial testimony from captured crew members, former captives themselves, men taken from slave ships the pirates had seized off the West African coast, some of whom joined the crew as free men under the same Articles everyone else signed, drawing the same shares as anyone aboard. It's a detail modern audiences understandably want to read as pure moral progress, and the caution here matters. This wasn't abolitionism. It was, as best the record allows us to say, a practical crew absorbing skilled or willing hands wherever it found them, indifferent to a distinction the wider Atlantic world enforced with total brutality. But indifference, in 1719, was itself a strange and telling kind of exception, and Kennedy's own ledger, by all accounts, didn't discriminate in the counting. The tension that eventually undid Kennedy wasn't a dramatic betrayal at first. It was something much smaller and much more human, opportunity, handed to a man whose entire career had trained him to seize whatever wasn't nailed down. In 1720, during one of Roberts' cruises off the coast of what's now Guyana and Suriname, the crew seized a substantial prize, a captured ship, richly enough loaded that accounts of the period, with their usual imprecision about exact sums, describe it as one of the more valuable takes of Roberts' career to that point. Roberts, pursuing another vessel, left a detachment of the crew, Kennedy among them, and by several accounts effectively in charge of this splinter group, aboard the prize, with instructions to rejoin the main ship shortly after. They never did. What happened instead, according to the surviving depositions of men later captured and questioned, is that the detachment, flush with plunder and suddenly unsupervised by Roberts' famously strict discipline, decided among themselves by vote, in keeping with everything you've just learnt about how these decisions got made, to simply sail off with their portion of the haul rather than return it to the common stock and rejoin the fleet. It's worth sitting with how perfectly this decision fits, and simultaneously betrays the entire system this chapter has described. The vote was legitimate by the crew's own internal logic. A majority of the men present chose this course, exactly as the Articles empowered them to. And it was also a wholesale abandonment of the Articles' deeper purpose, which depended on every detachment eventually returning to the larger body, honouring shares owed to absent crewmates, keeping the collective enterprise collective. Democracy, it turns out, can vote to dissolve itself just as easily as it can vote a captain out. Kennedy, now effectively a captain in his own right over this breakaway crew, though accounts differ on whether he was formally elected to the post or simply fell into leading by default, turned the ship west, toward home, toward England and Ireland, carrying a fortune that several of the men aboard, per later testimony, had never seen the like of in their lives. Here is where Kennedy's illiteracy, mentioned earlier as a minor biographical detail, stops being minor. None of the men aboard the breakaway ship, by the accounts that survive, had any real skill in navigation, reading a chart, working a quadrant, calculating longitude by dead reckoning, were specialist skills that Roberts's ship had possessed, and this splinter crew simply did not. They aimed, as best they could reckon it, for Ireland. What they got, after a voyage of by guess and by God navigation across an entire ocean, was a landfall considerably further north and rougher than intended, on the coast of Scotland, near Edinburgh, sometime in early 1720, a detail almost comic in its bathos if you weren't one of the men standing on that unfamiliar shore with a fortune in stolen goods and absolutely no plan for what came next. What follows reads less like the climax of a pirate legend and more like an object lesson in what happens when an organisation's internal controls disappear the moment its structure does. With no articles governing them anymore, no elected quartermaster keeping the peace, no captain's battle discipline to fear, the crew fractured almost immediately on land, squabbling over the division of plunder. Drawing suspicion from locals unaccustomed to shabbily dressed sailors suddenly flush with foreign coin, drinking too visibly and talking too loudly in taverns where the wrong ears were listening. Several were arrested within weeks on charges connected to the theft, and, under questioning, the story of the breakaway crew and its cargo began to unravel in exactly the way Kennedy, of all people, should have recognised through testimony given by men trying to save their own necks by handing over someone else's. Kennedy himself made it further than most, drifting south through England, reportedly attempting to fence stolen goods and, in one grimly ironic episode recorded in the trial documents, allegedly betraying a former shipmate to authorities in an attempt to collect a reward and buy himself some safety. It didn't buy much. He was recognised, arrested, and by mid-1721 stood trial at the Old Bailey in London on charges of piracy, the very crime whose internal machinery he had, for a period of real consequence, helped run more fairly than almost any legitimate maritime employer of his era. The trial itself is one of the better documented moments in this whole story. Because Old Bailey proceedings were recorded and published for public consumption at the time, genuine primary source material, not the dramatised retelling of Johnson's general history. According to those surviving accounts, Kennedy attempted the same strategy that had failed him once already, cooperating with the prosecution, offering testimony against other pirates and associates in hopes of leniency for himself. It is a bleak, almost clinical irony that the man whose entire professional life had been built on enforcing a code of mutual trust among armed strangers spent his final weeks systematically breaking that same code in a courtroom, one name at a time, to save himself. It didn't work. Walter Kennedy was convicted and hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping in 1721, a site chosen specifically for pirates and other maritime criminals, positioned along the Thames at a point where the tide would wash over the gallows. A detailed contemporary accounts note with a kind of grim procedural precision that matches everything else about how the era's authorities handled piracy, not as chaotic. Villainy to be stamped out in fury, but as a specific legal category with its own specific deliberately public punishment, repeated at Cape Coast Castle a year later on a scale Kennedy's own solitary hanging never approached. There's no tidy moral to draw from Kennedy's downfall, and this chapter won't force one on you. He didn't die because the quartermaster system failed. He died because, given a moment when that system's checks briefly evaporated, no captain, no articles, no crew vote governing what happened next, he and the men around him chose the thing every human institution's designers have always had to guard against: short-term gain over the long-term structure that had, until that point, actually served him rather well. The tragedy, if that's even the right word for a convicted pirate's hanging, is that Kennedy understood the value of fair dealing better than almost anyone on Robert's ship. He'd built his entire reputation on it, and abandoned it the one time nobody was left to hold him to it. Back aboard Robert's main ship, the quartermaster's office didn't die with Kennedy. It was simply refilled, by vote, the way every vacated post on a pirate ship was refilled. Because the crew's survival never depended on any single man holding it, that was rather the entire point of building the role as an office rather than a personal loyalty. Roberts himself went on to become arguably the most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age by ships taken, a run of extraordinary success that finally ended in 1722 off the coast of West Africa, killed in battle against a Royal Navy warship, still by most accounts drinking his tea. His quartermasters across those years, Kennedy among the earliest, several others after him, administered a rotating cast of several hundred men through prize after prize without the kind of internal collapse that doomed Kennedy's breakaway crew. What Kennedy's specific failure reveals more than any success story could is what the quartermaster system was actually built to prevent, and where its limits sat. It could check a captain's tyranny in the moment, because the crew was always present to enforce that check collectively. It could not, on its own, survive the complete absence of the collective itself. A handful of men with a fortune and no structure around them reverted, with startling speed, to exactly the kind of short-sighted, every man for himself behaviour the articles had been designed from the outset to prevent. The system wasn't magic. It was scaffolding. Genuinely effective scaffolding. More effective than almost anything a merchant sailor of the era could hope for from his own legitimate employer. But scaffolding all the same, useless the moment enough of it came down at once. The title itself outlived every single man who ever held it aboard a pirate ship. Quartermaster survives today in navies and merchant marines around the world, though the modern job, navigation, signals, ship's stores in a far more literal sense, has drifted a long way from the elected peacekeeper and shop steward that men like Kennedy once were. It's a strange kind of legacy, a word that started as an ordinary logistics title, got reshaped by outlaws into something closer to a constitutional office, and then drifted back into ordinary maritime use once the Golden Age of Piracy burned itself out in the 1720s. Its more radical implications quietly forgotten along with most of the men who'd relied on them. What's worth sitting with on a quiet night thinking about all this is how strange it actually is that this office existed at all. These were, by any legal definition of their era, criminals, men operating entirely outside the reach of any government's protection, who could have organised themselves any way they liked, with nobody but each other to answer to. And a meaningful number of them chose, again and again, across different ships and different years and different captains, to build in a formal check against absolute power rather than simply hand it to whoever held the most cutlasses. Walter Kennedy's story doesn't undercut that. If anything, his downfall is the exception that proves how well the system usually worked, because the one time it truly failed was the one time its checks weren't present to fail against. Kennedy's story isn't the only surviving record of the office, either, and it's worth noting briefly how consistent the pattern was across crews that otherwise had little to do with one another. The wreck of the wider galley, Samuel Bellamy's ship, lost off Cape Cod in 1717 and rediscovered by marine archaeologists in the 1980s, has yielded physical evidence, coins, tools, ship's fittings. That corroborates the same broad division of labour described in Roberts' articles 2 years later, on a ship that operated an ocean away under a different captain entirely. That's the detail that should carry real weight here. This wasn't one eccentric crew's private arrangement. It was closer to an industry standard, independently arrived at and re-arrived at by crew after crew. The way competing companies in any era tend to converge on similar internal structures once enough of them discover, the hard way, what actually keeps people from turning on each other. Roberts kept his tea and his discipline. Kennedy's crew, briefly free of both, discovered exactly what an unwatched fortune does to men with nothing left holding them together, which is, as it happens, a lesson about the ship's actual daily life you're about to see up close. The bell wakes you before the light does. 8 strokes, brass on brass, the sound carrying flat and clear across water that's gone the colour of pewter, with dawn still an hour off. For a moment, lying in a hammock that swings with the roll of the ship, you could be back on any merchant vessel you ever served. Same bell. Same ache in your shoulders from a rope-taut canvas sling. Same smell of bilge water and old tar drifting up from below. What's different, you're slowly learning, isn't the rhythm of the day so much as who decides what fills it. Watches aboard this ship run in 2 rotating shifts, port and starboard, 4 hours on and 4 off around the clock. the same basic system the Royal Navy used, borrowed wholesale because nobody had invented a better way to keep a ship crewed at 3 a.m. What isn't standard is who assigned you to yours. Back on your old merchant ship, watch bills were posted by the mate. Take it or argue with the man who controlled your pay. Here, watches were settled by the same rough consensus that settles everything else. Silas Rowe posting a list, adjusting it when men had genuine grievances about always drawing the middle watch, the version of fairness that comes from having to face the same men you've inconvenienced at breakfast the next morning. It's a small thing. It is. You're starting to realise exactly the kind of small thing that adds up to the larger and stranger truth about this ship. Almost nothing here just happens to you. Almost everything gets negotiated, however roughly, by people who have to live with the outcome alongside you. Below decks, the smell of the morning mess reaches you before you're fully upright. Salt pork frying in a pan too small for the number of men waiting on it. And under that, the sharper smell of burnt sugar, because the ship's cook has a habit of caramelizing whatever molasses is left in the stores rather than let it spoil. His name is Cuff, a name given to him as it was given to countless enslaved men across the Atlantic world in this period, from the Akan Day name for a boy born on a Friday, by an owner who no longer has any claim on him. Cuff was taken off a slave ship a pirate crew seized 2 years before you signed on, and rather than being sold or ransomed, he chose to sign the same articles you did, drawing the same single share as any other hand aboard. He runs the galley now, one arm ending just below the elbow, lost. He'll tell you if you ask, and he's in the mood. To a wound gone bad rather than a battle, treated by the same surgeon who patched Josiah's hand, and cooking, by long custom on pirate ships, is a post often given specifically to a man whose injury makes the harder work of hauling rope or working a gun impractical. It's not charity exactly, any more than the injury compensation schedule was charity. It's the same underlying logic again, a system that would rather keep a wounded man useful and fed than discard him the moment he stops being able to climb rigging. By mid-morning, the deck fills with the particular flavour of governance you still haven't fully adjusted to. A muster that isn't really a muster, because nobody's checking attendance against a captain's private list. Roberts is visible on the quarterdeck as he usually is at this hour, but he isn't giving orders about the day's small business, provisioning, minor repairs, the handling of a dispute over a torn sail nobody wants to own up to damaging. That falls, as it falls every day that isn't a battle or a chase, to Silas. You watch him settle the sail dispute in about 90 seconds flat, assigning the mending to the 2 men closest to the tear regardless of blame, on the practical logic that arguing about fault wastes daylight the ship doesn't have to spare. Roberts, 20 feet away, doesn't so much as glance over. This is, you're beginning to understand, less a chain of command than 2 entirely separate chains running in parallel, one for violence, one for everything else, that only ever merge back into a single voice when cannon fire makes hesitation dangerous. Just past noon, the parallel chains merge in a different way. A vote gets called. A lookout has spotted a distant sail, hull down on the horizon, and the question on the table, put to the whole crew, not decided quietly between officers, is whether to break off the current course and give chase, or hold to the plan the crew agreed on 2 days before, aimed at a specific stretch of coastline where prizes are known to run thick this time of year. Here's the thing that catches you off guard. This isn't ceremonial. Men actually argue both sides, loudly standing on open deck, and Silas doesn't cut the debate short even when it runs past what feels like a reasonable length for a decision this practical. A hand goes up eventually, Roberts notably cast as one vote among many rather than a deciding one, and the majority carries, hold the course, let the distant sail go. You spend the rest of the afternoon watching that unidentified ship shrink back into the haze, and nobody complains about it, because everybody had their say, and the vote is, in some real sense, you're only starting to respect. The end of the argument rather than the start of a grudge. By your 3rd Sunday aboard, you've learned that Sunday means something specific here that it never meant on a merchant ship, weapons inspection, mandated by the articles Silas read aloud your first night, and treated with a seriousness that borders on ritual. Every man lays out his pistol, his cutlass, whatever else he's responsible for, and Silas moves down the row checking for rust. For a hammer that doesn't strike clean, for a blade gone dull enough to be useless in a fight. A man whose weapon fails this inspection loses a portion of his next share, not a small fine, a real one, because a ship whose crew can't shoot straight when it matters loses prizes, loses men, and eventually loses everything. You watch a man 2 files down from you get docked for a pistol he clearly hasn't cleaned in weeks, and you watch him take the penalty without much protest, because he signed the same document you did, and everyone present watched the same inspection happen the same way it happens every week. There's no favouritism to appeal to. There's just the schedule and the ritual, repeating itself with a regularity that would be almost soothing if the stakes weren't what they are. The gambling ban gets tested that same afternoon, when 2 men are caught with dice behind a stack of water casks, a clear violation of the very first rule in the articles, the one about no gaming for money aboard. What happens next surprises you less than it would have a month ago. No flogging, no summary punishment from an angry officer. Silas hears both sides, confiscates the dice and whatever coin was on the table, and assigns both men to an unpleasant stretch of bilge-pumping duty as the agreed penalty, a punishment that costs them sweat and pride rather than blood, calibrated. You're starting to suspect, specifically to fit a crime that harmed nobody but risked the kind of resentment and cheating accusations that could fester into something worse. It's a small moment. It tells you something large. This isn't a system optimized for cruelty. It's optimized for keeping several hundred armed men from killing each other over trivial disputes, and cruelty, used carelessly, would work against that goal as often as it worked for it. Not every dispute resolves as neatly as a stretch of bilge duty, and you learn this firsthand when a genuine grudge flares between 2 crewmen over a woman one of them had known in Nassau before this voyage. The details are murky, second-hand, relayed to you by a crewmate who heard it from someone else entirely, the way most gossip travels on a ship this size. Under the articles, striking a man aboard ship is itself an offence, whatever the provocation. So the 2 men, rather than settling it below decks with fists or blades, are made to wait until the ship next makes landfall, where the quarrel gets settled properly, pistols and swords, on the beach, under the eyes of witnesses appointed to make sure neither man cheats the terms. It sounds almost formal when you describe it that way. A duel, essentially, with rules, and in practice it mostly is. The point, as Silas explains it to you afterward, isn't to prevent violence altogether. Men who hate each other enough to fight generally find a way to fight. The point is to keep that violence from happening in a cramped space 30 feet from where everyone else is trying to sleep, load a gun, or trust the man beside them not to be nursing a private grudge with a knife in reach. What happens below decks after a night like that, after 2 men who nearly killed each other on a beach have to climb back into a boat together and row back out to the same ship, is honestly a stranger and quieter story than the fight itself, and not one this chapter has room to chase down properly. What matters here is simpler. The system doesn't eliminate anger. It just insists that anger take a form the rest of the crew can survive being near. Within a month of signing on, you get the moment with Cuff that stays with you longer than almost anything else from this stretch of the voyage. The ship takes a prize loaded, among other things, with a genuine store of good rum, not the watered, half-spoiled stuff that usually fills the ship's casks, but real, unspoiled cargo bound for a planter's table somewhere. Custom on this ship, and on most crews of the period by the accounts that survive, holds that a find like this gets shared out immediately and visibly, in the open rather than hoarded quietly for officers alone, and Cuff, who by rights could simply cook with it and say nothing, instead makes a point of setting aside the first proper measure for every man aboard before he touches a drop for the galley himself, moving down the deck with a battered tin cup and his one good arm, making sure the newest, lowest-ranked hands get poured before he does. You ask him, later, why he bothers with the ceremony of it. Why not just let the quartermaster handle the distribution the way he handles everything else? Cuff's answer, delivered without much sentiment, because sentiment isn't really his style, is that he spent years on a ship where nobody poured him anything, where his name wasn't even the one his mother gave him, and where the idea of choosing himself who eats first was so far outside his control it wasn't even a thought worth having. Now it is. It's a small kindness, freely given by a man who has every reason in the world to have stopped believing in small kindnesses. You don't say much back. There isn't much to say that wouldn't sound smaller than the thing he just told you. By 8 bells in the evening, the candles get snuffed below decks exactly as the articles require, and the ship shifts into whatever version of leisure a heavily armed criminal enterprise allows itself. A fiddler who signed the articles back in Nassau months before you did, a thin, cheerful man who lost most of his hearing in one ear to a badly timed cannon blast and never once complains about it. Plays something that isn't quite a work shanty and isn't quite a dance tune either, and a handful of men who were shouting at each other over dice or duels earlier in the week end up singing along regardless, badly, in at least 3 overlapping keys. It's not harmony in any musical sense. It's something else. The sound of several hundred men who didn't choose each other. In the way a family or a village chooses its members, finding a version of togetherness anyway, built entirely out of shared risk, shared rules, and a shared understanding that tomorrow could easily be the day any of it ends. You lie in your hammock afterward, listening to the last of the fiddle fade into the ordinary creak and groan of a ship holding its course through the dark, and you think about how little any of this resembles what you expected when that ledger man first walked your old deck, asking who could read a chart. You expected chains, more or less, however loosely worn. What you got instead was rules, more rules in some ways than you ever answered to as a free man on a merchant ship, except that here, for reasons you're still working out, you had a hand in setting a few of them, and a real say in enforcing the rest. Food, you learn fast, is its own small negotiation, repeated every single day in ways that never quite stop being tedious. The staples are what you'd expect from any long ocean voyage of this era. Salt beef and salt pork gone grey with brine, ship's biscuit hard enough to double as a weapon, and reliably threaded through with weevils that most men simply tap out onto the deck, without much comment. Dried peas. Whatever fresh food survives from the last landfall before it spoils. What's actually different here, once you look past the familiar list of staples, isn't the food itself. It's who decides how it gets portioned when supplies run short, which they do, roughly every 3rd week by your rough count. Cuff keeps a tally, marks scratched into a board, since he can't write in the conventional sense any more than half this crew can, and when rations have to be cut. They get cut evenly, Captain and Powder Monkey drawing the same reduced share, a detail that would have been unthinkable on your old merchant ship, where the officers' mess never once went hungry while the forecastle counted crumbs. On Sundays, when stores allow it, Cuff makes a boiled pudding out of flour, suet, and whatever dried fruit hasn't gone to rot. Duff, the crew calls it, a small weekly ritual that costs almost nothing and means, by the reaction it gets every single week, rather more than its size would suggest. Water is the harder rationing, and the one nobody jokes about. Casks go stale and sometimes foul within weeks in the heat, and the daily allowance measured out again under witness, rather than left to an officer's discretion, becomes the subject of more quiet tension than gold ever is. You watch Silas settle a dispute over a possibly shorted water ration, with the same procedural patience he brings to everything else, checking the cask himself, checking the measure, publicly correcting the error when he finds one, because a crew that starts believing its own quartermaster waters down their water is a crew that stops trusting the entire system within a week. Trust on this ship isn't abstract. It gets rebuilt in small unglamorous ways every single day over pudding and brine and half a cup of water that has to be exactly the same half cup every man beside you gets too. There's one more layer to the daily machinery you don't fully appreciate until a genuine crisis tests it. The specialist officers below the quartermaster, each elected the same way everyone else was: the master gunner, responsible for the cannon and the powder store that could kill every man aboard if handled carelessly; the boatswain, responsible for rigging, sail, and the general seaworthiness of the ship; a sailing master, when the crew has one, responsible for navigation. None of these men were appointed by Roberts. Each was chosen by the same vote that chose him, which means each answers, in the same practical sense Silas does, more to the men who elected him than to any captain's personal favour. You watch the master gunner, a broad taciturn man named Cross, who lost most of 2 front teeth to scurvy years before you ever met him, run a powder inspection with exactly the same unbending thoroughness Silas brings to the Sunday weapons check, because a sloppy gunner gets men killed just as surely as a corrupt quartermaster does, and the crew that elected him knows it. What strikes you, turning all this over during a slow afternoon watch, is how thoroughly this distributes the kind of trust that, on any ship you served before this one, concentrated in a single man behind a locked cabin door. Here, no one person controls the food, the weapons, the navigation, and the money, all at once. 4 or 5 different elected men each control one piece, each accountable to the same body of voters, each with every incentive to watch the others honestly, because a gunner who lets Cuffay skim the rations has no grounds to complain when his own powder stores come up short. It isn't trust in each other, exactly, that holds this together. It's trust in the arrangement, the belief, tested and mostly confirmed day after day, that the system itself will catch what any single dishonest man might otherwise get away with. You've started to notice, somewhat to your own surprise, that you sleep a little easier for it these nights, oddly enough, than you ever once did trusting a single merchant captain's word alone, unwitnessed, behind a locked cabin door. Within a year of that first Sunday inspection, you'll have stood through 50 more just like it, voted on a dozen course changes, watched at least 2 more disputes settled ashore under witness rather than left to fester below, and eaten more of Cuffay's caramelized molasses than you can count. None of it will feel remarkable by then. That's the strange trick of any system, criminal or otherwise. Once it's running well, the extraordinary becomes routine fast enough that you stop noticing it as extraordinary at all. But it was, and is. A ship's worth of men who answer to elected officers, settle their money in daylight, discipline their own through hearings rather than whims, and share out a stranger's stolen rum according to an unspoken code of who deserves to drink first, that was never supposed to be how criminals organize themselves, according to every story you'd ever been told before you lived it. What you haven't seen yet, though, is what happens when this whole careful arrangement gets tested by something the articles never quite anticipated. A captain the crew stops trusting, mid-voyage, with no time to spare for a hearing. What happens below decks and on the quarterdeck when trust finally does break, mid-voyage, with no time to spare for the kind of measured hearing you've just watched play out over dice and jewels, is a different story, and one of the best documented examples of it happened not under Roberts, but under a captain named Charles Vane, in the waters off the Bahamas in the fall of 1718. Picture the deck of Vane's ship on a clear night off the Bahamian coast, lookouts calling down word of a sail closing fast from the darkness, and then the shape of her resolving under moonlight into something no pirate crew wants to see up close. A well-armed French warship, gun ports lit, closing on an intercept course rather than fleeing the way a merchant prize would. Vane's crew, by the account that survives, wanted to fight. A well-loaded French vessel, even a dangerous one, represented exactly the kind of prize this entire enterprise existed to take, and pirate crews of this period fought outnumbered and outgunned more often than popular memory tends to credit them for, banking on speed, surprise, and the simple fact that a merchant crew or a poorly motivated naval press gang usually had far less to lose, or gain, from a fight than the pirates bearing down on them did. Every man aboard had a direct financial stake in that calculation, too, in a way a hired naval crew simply didn't. A captured French vessel meant real shares for every hand present, a fact that made the crew's appetite for the fight considerably more than mere bravado. Vane, watching the same warship close from the quarterdeck, made a different calculation. he gave the order to run. It's worth being honest about what the record here actually is, because this story, like so much of the popular Golden Age narrative, comes down to us primarily through Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 general history, the same disputed, occasionally dramatised source flagged earlier in this account. There is no surviving Admiralty transcript of the vote that followed. No ship's log entered into evidence at a formal trial describing the exact words spoken on deck that night. What we have is Johnson's telling, generally treated by historians as broadly reliable on structural questions like this one, how pirate crews actually handled a captain's failure, even where his specific dialogue and dramatic flourishes deserve real scepticism. With that caveat honestly on the table, according to that account, Vane's decision to flee, rather than fight, did not sit well with a crew that had signed on for exactly this kind of confrontation. To understand why that single decision was enough to end a captaincy, it helps to back up and understand who Charles Vane actually was before that night. He'd cut his teeth as a privateer turned pirate in the years just after the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713, a peace treaty that, almost overnight, put thousands of trained naval and privateering sailors out of legitimate work across the Caribbean and the American colonies, a genuine economic on-ramp into piracy that historians point to as one of the real, unglamorous drivers of the so-called Golden Age. Vane worked the waters around Nassau on New Providence Island, which by this point had become something closer to a pirate haven than a proper colonial settlement, a detail this account will come back to later, because it matters enormously to the larger question of how pirates organised themselves not just aboard a single ship, but as a loose community of ships sharing a base. He was, by most surviving descriptions, aggressive, competent at ship handling, and, this detail becomes important, notably reluctant to accept the terms of the King's pardon that Britain extended to Caribbean pirates in 1718, unlike a number of his contemporaries who took the offer and quietly retired from the trade. Vane's reputation among his own crew, even before the incident with the French warship, ran hot and cold. He was accused at various points in the surviving record of favouring certain men in the division of plunder and of picking fights, with other pirate captains notably, rather than with merchant prizes, for reasons that struck at least some of his crew as more about personal pride than sound strategy. None of this alone would have ended his command. Pirate crews tolerated captains with real flaws so long as those flaws didn't cost the crew money or blood. What changed the calculation on that clear night off the Bahamas was the sense, widely shared, if Johnson's account is to be trusted on this point, that Vane had let genuine fear of a fight override his duty to the men who'd elected him specifically to lead them into exactly this kind of confrontation. The vote itself, once the French warship had been outrun and the immediate danger had passed, appears to have happened quickly, a detail that matches the broader pattern seen already in this account, from the deck vote that made Roberts captain to the daily small-scale votes that governed course changes and disputes aboard his ship. There was no waiting for a formal hearing days later, no cooling-off period. The crew's confidence in Vane had broken in the space of a single evening, and the mechanism built into the ship's own articles, the same basic mechanism this whole account has been tracing since the first chapter, moved just as quickly in response. A new captain was proposed, votes were cast, and Vane found himself, within what the record suggests was likely no more than a day or two, formally removed from a post he'd held for months. The crew that carried out the vote against Vane didn't spend much time reflecting on the philosophical weight of what they'd done, as far as the record allows us to judge, because a ship still needed running the very next morning. Rackham led them on a string of further captures through the winter of 1718 and into 1719, working the same Bahamian and Cuban waters Vane had known well, and by most accounts the change in leadership did what depositions of this kind were meant to do. It restored, at least for a while, a working sense among the crew that their captain would actually fight for the prizes they'd signed on to take. That's the practical, unglamorous payoff of the whole mechanism, easy to lose sight of amid the drama of the vote itself. Nobody aboard that ship woke up the morning after Vane's removal thinking about legal theory or the nature of consent. They woke up thinking about the next sail on the horizon, and whether the man now standing where Vane used to stand would give the order to close on it rather than run. The man elected in his place was John Rackham, better known to history, and to nearly every pirate-themed film and cartoon since, by his nickname Calico Jack taken, according to most accounts, from his fondness for brightly patterned cotton clothing rather than the drab canvas most sailors wore. Rackham had served under Vane, by most reckonings as quartermaster or a similarly senior post, which fits the broader pattern this account keeps returning to. The office most likely to produce a crew's next captain wasn't some separate command track reserved for a captain's favourites. It was the office already closest to the crew's daily trust, the quartermaster's, because a man who'd spent months fairly dividing food and settling disputes had already demonstrated, in the most practical way available, exactly the kind of judgment a crew wanted in whoever led them next. What happened to Vane himself is where this story stops resembling a modern corporate ouster and reminds you, sharply, what kind of world this actually was. He wasn't simply relieved of command and left aboard as an ordinary hand, an arrangement that would have been dangerous for everyone involved, given how thoroughly he'd have resented his own former crew. Instead, Vane and a small number of men who'd remained loyal to him through the vote were put off the main ship and given a smaller prize sloop to sail away in, not quite a marooning in the harshest sense used elsewhere in the articles, where a man might be left on a bare spit of sand with a single pistol and a bottle of water, but a real diminishment all the same. Fewer men, a smaller vessel, and a fresh start built on the wreckage of a command he'd held only days before. It's worth sitting, briefly, with how much dignity that arrangement actually preserved, compared to what the same crew's own articles technically permitted. A captain who'd led his men into genuine danger through cowardice had, by the letter of most pirate codes of the period, exposed himself to far harsher penalties than a smaller ship and a diminished company. The crew chose the milder path. It didn't save him in the end. Vane continued pirating with his reduced company for roughly another year, by most accounts with steadily diminishing fortune and steadily fraying loyalty among the men who remained, the kind of slow unravelling that tends to follow a leader whose crew already once decided, formally and collectively, that they didn't fully trust him. A hurricane wrecked his ship in early 1719, according to the surviving record. Stranding him, he was eventually recognised, captured, and shipped to Jamaica, where he was tried for piracy and hanged at Gallows Point, Port Royal, in March of 1721, a death that grimly arrived by the same formal legal machinery that eventually caught up with nearly every pirate captain of this era who didn't die in battle first. Rackham, for his part, didn't fare dramatically better in the long run. Though his story took a stranger turn than Vane's, he's remembered today less for his own conduct as captain than for two of the crew members who sailed under him in his final years, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two women who fought alongside his crew disguised at various points as men, and whose own trial testimony in 1720 remains one of the more startling documents to survive from this period, precisely because so little else from the era gives women's voices this kind of direct legal record. Both were convicted alongside the rest of Rackham's crew, and both, according to the surviving court record, escaped hanging by declaring themselves pregnant, a claim the court was legally obligated to investigate before carrying out any sentence, and one that appears in at least Reed's case to have been true, though she reportedly died of fever in custody before any execution could have happened regardless. That's a fuller story than this chapter has room for tonight. What matters here is simpler. Rackham himself was captured later in 1720 and hanged in Jamaica in November of that year, meaning that within roughly 2 years of the vote that made him captain, both the man he replaced and the man who replaced him were dead by the same rope. There's a genuine, sobering irony sitting at the centre of that fact, and it's worth naming plainly rather than smoothing over for the sake of a tidier story. The system this whole account has been describing, democratic in structure, more accountable in its daily operation than almost any legitimate maritime employer of the period, didn't save either man from the gallows. It couldn't. No internal vote, however fair, could shield a pirate from the external legal reality closing in around the entire trade by 1720, as the Royal Navy expanded its anti-piracy patrols and colonial governments abandoned the leniency that had briefly let places like Nassau flourish. The crew's own governance handled the crew's own problems remarkably well. It had no power at all over the much larger, much better armed problem waiting for nearly all of them on shore. It's worth comparing this whole episode, briefly, to what mutiny meant everywhere else at sea in this era, because the contrast is really the whole point of tonight's story. Aboard a Royal Navy vessel, removing a captain mid-voyage, however incompetent, however cowardly his conduct, wasn't a vote. It was mutiny, a capital offence in its own right, regardless of whether the captain deserved removal. Men who moved against even a genuinely terrible naval commander risked the same rope waiting for the captain they'd deposed, which meant that in practice, crews endured astonishing failures of leadership rather than risk the gallows for correcting them. Merchant crews had it little better. A ship's owner back in London, not the men actually risking their lives at sea, held the only vote that mattered, and that vote was cast in a counting house thousands of miles from any storm or any French warship bearing down in the dark. Pirate crews inverted this completely, and did so, as best the surviving record allows historians to judge, without treating it as radical or unusual. It was simply how the job worked. A captain served at the pleasure of the men he led, full stop, and a single failure of nerve, not corruption, not cruelty, just one bad decision at the wrong moment, was grounds enough to end his command by the same evening. It's tempting, looking back from 3 centuries later, to reach for a word like democracy and let it do more work than it should. These were armed criminal enterprises, not parliaments, and the vote that removed Vane was backed by cutlasses as much as by consensus. But the underlying instinct, that authority earned by election, could be revoked by the same means, quickly, without waiting for a distant court's permission. Genuinely did put pirate crews ahead of nearly every other maritime workforce of their century in terms of practical accountability, even while those same crews operated entirely outside the law in every other respect. It's worth letting that sit for a moment rather than rushing past it. The most functional system of accountable leadership at sea in the whole of the 1710s and 1720s belonged, by most honest measures, to the men everyone else at the time considered beneath contempt. What should genuinely surprise you, turning this story over one more time before it's let go, isn't that a pirate crew removed a failing captain. It's how unremarkable that removal was to the men who carried it out. There's no surviving account of Vane's deposition being treated, at the time, as some extraordinary constitutional moment. No sense from the record that anyone aboard thought they were doing something history would remember as a milestone in maritime self-governance. They were just solving an immediate, practical problem the fastest way their own rules allowed, the same way Silas Rowe settled a torn sail dispute in 90 seconds a few segments ago. That, more than anything else, is what should sit with you. The most striking piece of pirate self-organisation in the historical record wasn't a grand experiment anyone set out to run. It was a group of frightened, furious men doing the obvious thing available to them under a system they'd built for exactly this contingency, without any sense that they were being unusual at all. Vane's deposition wasn't a one-off curiosity, either, however memorably Johnson tells it. The articles of other pirate captains, where they survive, wrote the possibility directly into law rather than leaving it to custom. The articles associated with Captain John Phillips, drawn up aboard his ship in 1723 and preserved because they were entered as evidence at his crew's later trial, explicitly list cowardice in battle as a punishable offence under the crew's own code, not left implicit, the way it apparently was under Vane, but spelled out in ink before a single cannon had fired, so that every man signing knew in advance exactly what would happen to a captain, or to anyone else, who broke and ran when the fighting started. That's a meaningful detail on its own. By the early 1720s, pirate crews weren't inventing the concept of an accountable, removable captain, fresh each time a crisis forced the question. They were writing it down as settled precedent, the same way any organisation eventually formalises a rule it's learnt the hard way it needs, Other captains met similarly abrupt ends for similar reasons, scattered across the surviving trial records and depositions of the period, even where the specific circumstances are thinner than Vane's relatively well-documented case. A captain who hoarded plunder, who showed persistent favouritism in dividing shares, who simply lost the confidence of enough of his crew through some combination of bad luck and bad judgment, faced a genuine and immediate risk of the same fate. A vote, a replacement, sometimes a diminished sloop and a fresh start, sometimes considerably worse depending on how badly he'd betrayed the specific terms of the articles he himself had signed. The pattern that emerges once you set Vane's story beside Phillips's written rules and the scattered evidence from other crews isn't of one dramatic exception proving how unusual pirate democracy really was. It's of a genuinely common practice, common enough that a crew drawing up brand new articles in 1723 thought to write the rule down explicitly. Having presumably watched or heard about exactly this kind of crisis play out enough times to know it was worth planning for in advance. Captain Edward England, working the Indian Ocean around the same years as Vane, was deposed for something like the opposite failing, showing what his own crew judged to be excessive mercy toward captured captains, rather than plundering them thoroughly enough, and was marooned along with several loyal followers on the island of Mauritius, according to the surviving accounts. The specific grievance differed from Vane's entirely. The mechanism used to settle it didn't differ at all. Vane ran from a fight and lost a command he'd have kept, almost certainly, on any legitimate naval vessel of his era, regardless of how badly he'd frightened his crew. Rackham inherited that command by the same vote that ended it, and lasted barely 2 years longer before the same gallows caught up with him too. What outlived them both, and outlived the specific ship they fought over that night off the Bahamas, was the mechanism itself, quietly reused, on crew after crew, whenever a captain's nerve failed at the wrong moment, and a quartermaster stood ready, as quartermasters so often were, to take his place. Neither man, in the end, got to choose how his story ended, but for a few days off the Bahamas, at least one of them got to choose who led him. And that's more than most sailors of the age, pirate or otherwise, could ever say about their own lives, merchant hand, naval rating, or forced man alike, answering to owners and admiralties an ocean away who never once asked their opinion of anything. That mechanism depended on something this account hasn't examined closely yet. The money itself, and exactly how a haul of stolen goods actually got turned into shares a man could trust. That money, and how a stolen fortune actually turned into a fair count of coin in your own pocket rather than a captain's private hoard, is the part of pirate life you're about to watch up close, because the chase you've been half listening to from below finally ends in a capture. Smoke first, that's what reaches you before anything else, acrid and close and faintly sulphurous, drifting back across your own deck from a bow chaser gun that's just put a warning shot cleanly across the target's rigging. You've been part of this crew long enough now that the chase itself barely quickens your pulse the way it did the first time. A merchant sloop, overladen and undergunned, spotted at dawn and run down by early afternoon. Her captain wisely striking his colours rather than testing whether your ship's reputation is exaggerated. What still gets your attention, every single time this happens, is the strange calm that follows the moment of surrender. No wild scramble for loot, no every man for himself grabbing of whatever glitters first, but something closer to an orderly work crew arriving for a routine inventory. That calm isn't an accident. It's enforced, deliberately, by the same articles you signed weeks ago, and breaking it carries a cost steep enough that even the greediest man aboard thinks twice. The very first hands over the rail, cutlasses still drawn, aren't grabbing anything at all. They're securing the prize crew, disarming them, herding them amidships, making sure nobody below has a hidden pistol or a grudge worth dying for, while a second party, working under Silas Rowe's direct eye, begins a methodical search of the hold. This is the detail that would genuinely surprise you most if you were watching all of this unfold from outside. Any man caught pocketing so much as a single coin before the official counting is treated as a serious violator of the articles, subject to real, meaningful punishment up to and including marooning. Because private theft from a prize isn't seen as some small transgression against an abstract rule, it's seen as direct theft from every other man aboard, since whatever one man hides away is one man's whole crew paid short as a result. You watch two hands empty their own pockets, unprompted, the moment Silas glances their way, dropping a handful of loose coin onto a growing pile on the open deck, without being asked twice. Down in the hold, hauling a barrel of what turns out to be Brazilian sugar toward the tally line, heavier than it looks, and sweating faintly through its staves in the humid tropical heat below deck, you run into Davy, 11 or 12 years old by his own uncertain reckoning, small enough still to squeeze through the tightest spaces below decks with ease, employed officially as a powder monkey, running cartridges from the magazine to the guns during a fight. He wasn't taken by force the way you were. He signed on, he tells you with the particular bluntness only a child seems able to manage, because a life-running powder for a share of the plunder beat a life sweeping a chandler's floor in Bristol for wages that never quite covered his keep. He has a habit, you notice over the following weeks, of counting things under his breath, barrels, coins, the number of steps between decks, a tick that seems to steady him, and one the older hands have learnt not to interrupt. By the time the tally board comes out on deck, a slate, chalk, and Silas presiding over it with the same procedural patience he brings to everything else. The full inventory of the captured sloop has taken shape, several hogsheads of sugar, a modest chest of coin somewhere in the low hundreds of pieces of 8 by Silas's running count, bolts of dyed cloth, a quantity of indigo, and a handful of navigational instruments nobody aboard your ship particularly needs, but that will fetch a decent price in the right port. None of this gets valued in secret. Silas calls out each item and his rough estimate of its worth loudly enough for anyone on deck to object if the number sounds wrong, and more than once during your time aboard, someone has objected, loudly, and been proven right. By your third prize taken under these particular articles, you've watched this exact ritual enough times now to recite the share divisions from memory, the way you might once have recited a catechism drilled into you as a child. Captain and quartermaster draw roughly a share and a half to 2 full shares each. Depending on the specific articles this crew agreed to, the surviving text of Bartholomew Roberts' own articles fixes the captain's cut at 2 shares and the quartermaster's at 1.5. A detail preserved because a captured crewman handed the document over during questioning in 1721, and it survives today in the Colonial records exactly as written, word for word. Master gunner and boatswain draw a share and a quarter. Other petty officers draw a share and an eighth. Everyone else, you, Davy, Cuff in the galley, the newest forced man barely a week aboard, draws 1 whole share, full stop, no distinction made for seniority beyond that. It is, by the standards of any legitimate maritime employer of your century, a genuinely narrow gap between the top of the ladder and the bottom of it, especially set against a merchant ship's owner drawing the entire profit while paying his crew a flat wage regardless of the voyage's success. What still needs saying, because it's easy to romanticize past the point of accuracy, is what this money actually was, not treasure in the glittering, doubloon-strewn sense the word conjures now, but a genuinely mixed bag of coin, goods and on crews working certain routes, including some Roberts himself worked off the West African coast, captives taken from other vessels and valued, with total moral indifference, as part of the divisible plunder. That's an ugly fact sitting inside an otherwise almost admirable system of internal fairness, and it deserves to sit there uncomfortably, rather than get smoothed over for the sake of a tidier story about pirate democracy. The fairness of the division didn't make the underlying trade any less brutal to the people caught inside it, who weren't lucky enough to be offered a share themselves. Valuing goods that aren't simple coin turns out to be its own small specialty aboard this ship, and you watch it happen with real, genuine interest the first time a shipment of dyed cloth and raw indigo comes up for appraisal, rather than a straightforward chest of silver coin. Silas doesn't guess. He defers, for this part of the count, to an older hand named Perrott, who spent years before turning pirate working as a factor's clerk in a Bristol trading house and still knows, with real precision, roughly what a bolt of this particular weave or a pound of that particular dye fetches on an honest market. Knowledge that translates, with some discount for the fact that pirate goods have to move through less reputable channels, into a rough but defensible figure Silas then calls out to the assembled crew. It's a small illustration of something this whole account keeps circling back to. The fairness of the system depended not just on honest men, but on the crew's collective willingness to actually use whatever specialised knowledge happened to be sitting in its own ranks, rather than let a single officer's guesswork stand unchallenged, simply because no one else spoke up. Perrott's estimate gets tested too, the way everything on this deck eventually gets tested by someone with a stake in the outcome. A younger hand who'd apprenticed briefly with a dyer before running off to sea argues the indigo is worth rather more than Perrott's figure suggests, citing a specific recent price he'd heard quoted in Kingston before this voyage began. The two go back and forth for a few minutes, in front of the whole crew, until they land on a compromise figure neither man is fully satisfied with, but both can live with, which is, you're realising, close to the actual definition of fairness this ship operates by. Not perfect accuracy. Not any one man's unquestioned final authority. Just enough transparent argument, conducted where everyone present can hear every word of it, that the final number feels genuinely earned rather than simply imposed from above by whoever happens to be holding the chalk that day. Tension breaks the calm of the counting only once during this particular division, when a hand named Cobb, a broad-shouldered topman you've exchanged maybe 10 words with in as many weeks, accuses another crewman of pocketing a ring during the initial search, holding it back from the common pile. It's a serious charge, and Silas handles it the way he handles everything, not by taking Cobb's word or the accused man's denial at face value, but by questioning the two witnesses who'd been working the same section of the hold, checking whether either had seen anything, and only then, once the accused man's own sea chest is searched with his reluctant permission and comes up empty, declaring the matter settled with no ring ever found. Cobb doesn't get punished for the accusation. A false alarm raised honestly isn't a crime under the Articles. Only a false one raised maliciously. But you notice him keeping a wary distance from the man he accused for the rest of the week regardless, the kind of small, lingering friction that no amount of procedural fairness can fully dissolve. Systems can settle facts. They can't always settle feelings. What happens below decks between two men who've accused each other of theft, once the official matter is closed but the private grudge isn't, is its own quiet drama this chapter doesn't have room to chase. Silas has an eye on it, the way he has an eye on most simmering disputes aboard. And that's as much reassurance as you get for now. The captured sloop's own crew, a dozen merchant sailors who never asked to be part of any of this, get their own hearing of sorts once the inventory is finished, and it's here that the system's practical self-interest shows through most plainly. Silas walks the line of frightened men the same way the ledger keeper walked yours weeks earlier, looking for skills worth recruiting, offering the same choice you were offered, the same warning about what a genuine no would mean for their treatment versus what a coerced yes would mean for their legal standing later. Most decline. A carpenter and a young able seaman accept, for reasons that likely mirror your own, better prospects aboard a well-run pirate ship than aboard the next merchant vessel willing to hire them at starvation wages. The rest are given back their own sloop, stripped of its cargo but seaworthy, and left to sail on to whatever port they were bound for, a little poorer, and with a story that will follow them the rest of their lives. It's not mercy in any sentimental sense. A crew of resentful captives left to starve or drown serves nobody's interest. A crew released intact, with a plausible tale of pirate ruthlessness balanced against pirate restraint, does more for this ship's reputation in the next port than any amount of cruelty would. Davy finds you afterward, still counting under his breath. Barrels this time, 31 of them. He informs you with real satisfaction, correcting himself once and starting the count over from the beginning rather than let an uncertain number stand, and asks whether you think the released sailors will tell people about the sugar or about being let go unharmed? You don't have an answer. He decides, on his own, after a moment's genuine consideration, that it'll probably be both, and moves on to help stow the rigging you're both meant to be securing, the question apparently settled to his own satisfaction, if not entirely to yours. By your fifth prize taken under these articles, a rougher engagement than the sloop, a proper fight against a merchantman that returned fire before striking her colours, Davy takes a wound running cartridges through a companionway when a stray splinter thrown off by a cannonball catches him across the forearm, deep enough to need the surgeon's needle, and deep enough that he can't run powder again for weeks. You find him afterwards sitting against a coil of rope, pale, holding his bandaged arm the way a much older man might, and it's the closest you've come, in your whole time aboard, to genuinely fearing for someone else's life more than your own. The wound isn't fatal. It's not even in the surgeon's blunt assessment, especially serious as ship's wounds go, but watching an 11-year-old absorb the particular unfairness of a job that pays him the same single share as a grown man while asking rather more of his small body to earn it, that lands somewhere the article's careful fairness can't quite reach. What does reach it, in its own limited way, is the same compensation schedule you learnt about back on your very first week aboard. A wound serious enough to keep a man from his duty for a stretch draws a payout from the common stock under most cruise articles, prorated by severity rather than reserved only for lost limbs, and Silas settles Davy's claim without any of the boy having to ask, a detail Davy mentions to you later with the same flat, uncomplicated satisfaction he brings to counting barrels, as though it never occurred to him the payout might not come. Maybe that's the saddest part, and the most hopeful part of this whole system in the same breath. A boy young enough that fairness still feels like the natural order of things, aboard the one kind of ship in the entire Atlantic world of 1720 where that expectation is, more often than not, actually met. Within a year of your first counting on deck, you'll have sat through, by a rough tally not unlike Davy's own habit, somewhere around a dozen more, each one following the same basic shape with only the cargo and the size of the pile ever really changing. Sugar becomes, cloth becomes, coin becomes, on one memorable occasion, a chest of surgical instruments nobody quite knows the value of until a port broker sets a price weeks later. What never changes is the order of operations, search, tally, open accounting, division by the same fixed ranks every man aboard agreed to before this voyage even started, and Davy's barrel count murmured under his breath through all of it, steady as the tide. You think, occasionally, about what this would have looked like on your old merchant ship, a captain's private ledger, kept below in a locked cabin, an owner's fixed wage regardless of how rich the voyage turned out to be, no appeal available to a sailor who suspected he was being shorted beyond quietly grumbling to his messmates, and hoping the next captain proved less crooked than the last. Here, the appeal is built in, standing on deck in the person of a wiry quartermaster with a slate and a reputation to protect. It doesn't make any of this less illegal, less dangerous, or less likely to end at the end of a rope for most of the men involved. It just makes it, in this one specific and genuinely surprising respect, fairer than almost anything waiting for you back on land. Fairer. Strange as it feels to admit, than the very trade you left behind to end up here in the first place. Some of the historical hauls behind this whole system give a better sense of scale than any single sloop's cargo can. The wider galley, Samuel Bellamy's ship, the same wreck mentioned earlier, rediscovered off Cape Cod in the 1980s, is believed, based on the volume of coin and silver recovered from the seabed by marine archaeologists, to have carried a treasure in the range of tens of thousands of pieces of 8 at the time she sank in a storm in 1717, representing the accumulated plunder of dozens of captured vessels over roughly a year of Bellamy's operations along the American coast. Divided by even a generous estimate of the roughly 140 some men aboard her at the time, using the same graduated share system this chapter has described, that treasure would have made an ordinary hand genuinely wealthy by the standards of his era, years of a labourer's wages compressed into one division of the spoils, assuming, grimly, that he lived long enough afterward to spend it. Most didn't. The Wider went down with nearly her entire crew aboard, a storm succeeding where the Royal Navy so often failed. That's the trade this whole ledger and counting board system was really built around. Extraordinary reward set directly against extraordinary risk, both distributed by the same fixed, transparent formula regardless of whether the voyage ended in a genuine fortune or a shipwreck at the bottom of the sea. You think about that arithmetic more than you'd like to. Some nights, turning over the numbers Silas calls out on deck against the numbers a coroner's inquest might eventually call out over your own body. Nobody aboard pretends otherwise. The size of your potential share and the size of your potential grave are, on this particular ship, honestly and openly the same conversation, which is, in its own bleak way, more respect than most employers of your century ever showed the men who died making them rich. Not every crew's fortune reached the scale of Bellamy's, and it's worth resisting the temptation, however tempting the image, to imagine every pirate voyage ending in a shipwreck's worth of silver. Far more common, by the pattern that emerges across surviving trial records and captured articles, was a modest haul divided among a modest crew. Enough coin from a single merchantman to give each man a genuinely useful sum, a season's worth of decent living once he found a port willing to take his money without too many questions, rather than a fortune to retire on. Bartholomew Roberts himself, across a career that took an estimated 400 prizes or more by the time of his death in 1722, a number historians treat as broadly reliable, drawn from the sheer volume of captured ship reports filed by colonial governors across the Caribbean and West Africa during his years of operation, built his reputation less on any single spectacular haul than on the sheer grinding consistency of the counting board coming out on deck, again and again, year after year. The ordinary machinery of this chapter running so smoothly that it rarely made news on its own. It's the unglamorous consistency more than any single treasure that actually explains why so many men kept signing articles they knew could end at the gallows. The payouts were real and regular in a way very little else available to a sailor of this century ever was. That fairness, though, depended on something else entirely, a piece of cloth run up a mast, understood by friend and enemy alike without a single word needing to be exchanged. Picture the lookout aboard a Dutch merchantman off the West African coast in early 1722, glass pressed to his eye, watching a ship close steadily from the horizon, with a flag climbing its mast that he almost certainly already knows, by reputation alone, well before he can even make out the detail properly. Black field, a skeletal figure standing astride two sculls, and beneath them, stitched or painted in, two sets of initials, Ab and Am. He doesn't need to know Latin or heraldry to read this flag correctly, and neither did any sailor working these dangerous waters in this period, literate or otherwise. Every sailor working these waters by 1722 knew exactly what those letters meant, and exactly whose ship flew them: Bartholomew Roberts, the same captain whose tea-drinking discipline and elected quartermasters this account has already described in some detail, and a flag that wasn't decoration. It was a message, sent across open water before a single shot had been fired, and this is the story of what that message actually said, why it said it, and what it ultimately cost the man who flew it. To understand why a flag could carry that much weight, it helps to understand what pirate flags were actually for, stripped of the romantic haze 3 centuries of storybooks and film adaptations have since layered over them. The popular name, Jolly Roger, has a genuinely disputed origin, one worth pausing on briefly. Some historians trace it to the French phrase Joli Rouge, meaning roughly pretty red, a nod to the blood-coloured flags that, confusingly to most modern audiences, actually signalled the considerably more dangerous of the 2 standard warnings a pirate ship might choose to raise, while other historians dispute that particular etymology entirely and treat it instead as a folk explanation layered on well after the fact, with no solid contemporary evidence to back it. What isn't disputed at all, regardless of which etymology one accepts, is the practical function the flag served in actual use, a negotiating tool raised specifically to end an engagement quickly before it truly began, rather than one meant to guarantee bloodshed at all. The system, as best it can be reconstructed from surviving trial depositions and captured captains' own written accounts, generally worked in two distinct, well-understood stages. A black flag, raised first, signalled unambiguously that the approaching ship was indeed a pirate, no ambiguity left standing, no false colours pretending to be a friendly merchantman. A clear and deliberate declaration of intent, but crucially, it also signalled clearly that surrender, offered promptly enough, would likely be met with relatively lenient treatment overall, cargo taken, perhaps some crew invited to join, the rest set free or left with their ship, in keeping with exactly the pattern this account has already traced through Roberts's own crew's handling of a captured sloop. A red flag, raised only if the black one was ignored and resistance offered instead, signalled something considerably grimmer still and more final: no quarter, meaning no mercy of any kind extended to a crew that chose to fight and subsequently lost. It's a system built, when you strip away the skull and crossbones theatre surrounding it, around a genuinely rational incentive at its core: convince your target to surrender without a fight wherever possible. Because a fight costs your own crew blood, and time neither can really afford to lose, prize after prize, voyage after weary voyage. Individual pirate captains, well understanding this underlying logic quite clearly, went considerably further than a generic skull and crossbones design might suggest, customizing their own flags into something closer to a personal signature. A detail modern reconstructions and museum displays sometimes flatten into a single uniform Jolly Roger image, when the actual historical variety, drawn from surviving descriptions in trial records and captured captains' testimony, was considerably stranger and more individual. Blackbeard, properly Edward Teach or Thatch. Spellings vary considerably across the surviving sources depending on which clerk happened to be writing them down that particular day, is described in later accounts as flying a flag showing a horned skeleton, an hourglass, and a spear piercing a bleeding heart. Though it's worth flagging honestly that the specific, precise original design attributed to him rests on second-hand and later reconstructions rather than a single surviving contemporary illustration, the same caution this account has applied throughout to material tracing back toward Johnson's dramatised general history. What isn't in doubt at all, whatever the uncertainty around the precise original artwork, is the underlying logic behind it: a flag meant to be recognised instantly, feared thoroughly, and specifically associated with one man's growing reputation, so that the mere sight of it climbing a mast might end an engagement before Blackbeard's crew ever had to fire so much as a single shot in anger. Roberts took this same underlying logic somewhere considerably more personal still, and the story behind his specific design remains one of the better documented examples anywhere in the surviving record of a pirate flag functioning as genuine targeted communication rather than generic, one-size-fits-all intimidation aimed at nobody in particular. The initials Ab and Am stood, according to the accounts that survive, for a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, a direct, unmistakable threat aimed squarely and deliberately at the colonial governments of Barbados and Martinique specifically, both of which had, in the years before this particular flag first appeared, dispatched armed sloops with the explicit mission of hunting Roberts down wherever he went. He answered that specific, pointed threat with an equally specific message of his own: run up his own mast for every sailor from those two islands to read plainly and understand instantly, come after me. And this is precisely what waits for you at the end of it. It's a level of individualized, almost bureaucratic precision, a threat addressed in effect to two specific named recipients across an ocean, that the generic skull and crossbones image most people picture today simply doesn't capture at all. The flag's negotiating function meant it did real, measurable work in reducing bloodshed on both sides, and surviving depositions from captured merchant captains bear this out with a consistency that's easy to miss amid the more dramatic stories this account has favoured so far. A merchant captain who struck his colours the moment Roberts' flag came into view, surrendering without firing a shot, stood a genuinely good chance of losing his cargo and little else, his crew questioned. Perhaps a few skilled hands invited to join, the rest released with their stripped ship to carry on. A captain who chose to fight, gambling that his own guns and his own crew's courage might turn the engagement, took on a real risk of the red flag's promise being made good, his own crew paying in blood for a fight the flag itself had already offered them a way to avoid. Understood this way, the flag wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was closer to a blunt, brutal, but genuinely functional early warning system. A way of externalizing the same core logic that governed Robert's own crew internally, clear rules, stated in advance, applied consistently enough that everyone on both sides of the exchange knew roughly what to expect. That consistency, though, cut in both directions, and this is where Robert's particular flag stopped being merely a threat and started being a kind of prophecy. 2 colonial governments he'd named on his own mast didn't forget the insult easily, and by early 1722 the Royal Navy had assigned a specific vessel, Ms. Swallow, under Captain Challoner Ogle, to the specific task of hunting Roberts down in the waters off West Africa, where he'd spent much of the previous 2 years operating with near-total impunity. Roberts and Blackbeard weren't the only captains to turn this same underlying logic into something like a personal brand, either, and looking briefly at a couple of others helps show just how consistent the underlying pattern really was, even as the specific imagery on display varied so wildly from ship to ship and captain to captain. Christopher Moody, an English pirate active in the same general years and waters as Roberts, is described in surviving accounts as flying a striking red flag, again using the more severe no-quarter colour rather than the more common black, showing a winged hourglass alongside an arm wielding a sword and a white skull. A design meant to communicate urgency as much as menace. Surrender now, the hourglass seems to say, because time to do so safely is already running out. One of the earliest documented uses of a skull and crossed bones design specifically, meanwhile, is associated with a French pirate named Emmanuel Wynne, recorded flying such a flag as early as 1700 in an English naval officer's own account. Genuinely one of the closest things to a primary source origin point for the image most people picture today when they hear the words pirate flag at all, predating Roberts's and Blackbeard's more famous variations by nearly 2 decades. What ties all of these together, skeleton and hourglass and initialed skulls alike, is the same underlying function this chapter has kept returning to. A flag was never simply decoration, and never simply a generic warning either. It was a specific, legible message, tailored by a specific captain to a specific audience, functioning inside a shared code that both pirates and their targets understood well enough to act on without a word spoken. That's the detail worth holding on to more than any single skull design, an entire informal signalling system, invented and refined by outlaws with no central authority coordinating any of it. Converging independently, ship after ship, captain after captain, on roughly the same 2-stage logic of warning before violence, is one more small, strange example of exactly the pattern this whole account keeps circling back to. Men operating entirely outside the law, building genuinely functional shared systems anyway. Because the alternative, chaos with no rules at all, served nobody's interests, friend or enemy, pirate or prey alike. The engagement that finally caught up with Roberts came on the 10th of February 1722, off Cape Lopez on the West African coast, and the surviving accounts, this time resting on considerably firmer ground than Johnson's more dramatised material, since Ogle's own official reports to the Admiralty survive as genuine primary documents, describe a battle that began, fittingly enough, with a flag. Roberts' ship, the Royal Fortune, was anchored near a captured prize when Swallow was sighted. By several accounts, Roberts and much of his crew had been drinking heavily the night before, in the kind of unguarded celebration that comes easily to men who've spent 2 years operating with near total impunity across an entire ocean. And the ship was slow to ready itself for what turned out to be a serious naval engagement rather than another easy merchant capture. Roberts himself, dressed by most accounts in a rich crimson waistcoat and a hat with a red feather, a detail almost too theatrical to be believed, and yet one that appears consistently enough across multiple sources to be treated as broadly reliable, took the quarterdeck to direct the fight personally, the same instinctive assumption of full battle authority this account described all the way back in its opening chapters. He didn't survive it. A blast of grapeshot from Swallow's guns struck Roberts in the throat early in the engagement, killing him almost instantly, according to the Admiralty's own official account of the battle. A death fast enough that he may never have fully understood his own ship was losing. What his crew did next is one of the more genuinely moving details in this entire story, and one grounded in real testimony rather than embellishment, rather than let his body be captured, stripped, and displayed as a trophy of the Royal Navy's victory, the standard. Deliberately humiliating fate reserved for defeated pirate captains remains in this era. His crew, honouring what several accounts describe as his own standing wish, weighted his body and committed it to the sea, still in his fine clothes, denying Ogle and the Crown the public spectacle they'd have otherwise made of him. It's a small, fierce act of loyalty carried out in the middle of a battle his side was actively losing, by men who had every practical reason to abandon the gesture and save themselves instead, and chose not to. What happened to the roughly 272 survivors of Roberts's crew captured aboard the Royal Fortune and her consort ships after the battle is grim enough that it deserves to be stated plainly rather than softened. They were taken to Cape Coast Castle, a British-run fortification and slave trading post on the Gold Coast, and tried there in April of 1722 in one of the largest mass piracy trials of the entire era, a genuine legal proceeding with surviving trial records that historians treat as reliable primary sources, distinct from the more dramatised secondary accounts this chapter has repeatedly flagged elsewhere. Of those tried, 52 men were sentenced to hang, and the executions were carried out in batches over the following weeks, one of the largest single episodes of judicial killing connected to piracy in the entire Golden Age, a scale that should complicate any lingering romantic notion that pirates who lived by their own fair internal rules somehow escaped the brutal external consequences those rules could never fully protect them from. Others among the captured crew, based on evidence they'd been forced rather than willing participants, the same kind of forced designation this account described being entered into ship's books all the way back in its first chapter, were acquitted or sentenced to indentured servitude instead, a somewhat lesser fate that was nonetheless its own form of brutal confinement. A number of the youngest among them, boys not much older than Davy from the previous chapter, received the harshest possible reminder of how little their age mattered once a colonial court had them in its custody. The surviving trial record makes no special allowance for youth in the sentencing, treating a 15-year-old powder monkey's signature on a set of pirate articles with exactly the same legal weight as a grown quartermaster's. It's worth sitting, briefly, with the sheer scale of that number against everything this account has described about how fairly and functionally these crews governed themselves internally. 52 men, elected officers among them almost certainly, men who had voted on courses and divided shares and settled disputes through hearings rather than violence, hanged over a period of weeks at a colonial fortress built, with a bitter irony that shouldn't go unremarked, on the same coast and by the same colonial machinery that profited from the transatlantic slave trade, these same pirate crews had, in isolated and inconsistent ways, occasionally disrupted. The internal fairness this account has spent 5 chapters describing was real. It bought these men nothing at all against the external law that finally caught up with them. The same hard lesson Walter Kennedy's story, taught several chapters earlier, learned again, at a scale this time that no single chapter can fully soften. The flag itself outlived every man who ever sailed under it, in a stranger and more diffuse way than the quartermaster's title did. No physical example of Roberts's actual Ab and Amsh flag survives. Cloth from this period rarely does, especially cloth flown in active use and eventually captured, burned, or simply worn to rags by salt and weather. And much of what modern audiences picture when they hear pirate flag is a composite, assembled over the following 3 centuries from scattered written descriptions, trial testimony, and no small amount of later artistic invention. The specific skull and crossbones image most associated with piracy today owes at least as much to 19th and 20th century illustrators and, eventually, Hollywood, as it does to any single documented flag, actually flown in 1722. That's worth knowing, not to diminish the real history, but to sharpen it. The actual system was stranger, more varied and more individually meaningful than the flattened modern symbol suggests. A horned skeleton here, initialed skulls there, each flag a specific message from a specific man to specific enemies, rather than one uniform brand. There's a broader legacy worth noting too, one that has nothing to do with skulls at all. The basic logic underlying the black flag, red flag system, a clear signal offered before violence, promising better treatment for prompt surrender than for prolonged resistance, echoes forward into conventions that still govern warfare today, however differently dressed. The white flag of truce, the modern laws of war distinguishing between combatants who surrender and those who fight to the last. Even hostage negotiation protocols built around de-escalation rather than immediate force. All rest on the same underlying insight pirate captains of the 1710s and 1720s had already stumbled onto through hard, bloody trial and error. Violence is expensive. Surrender offered in good faith should be met in kind, and a clear signal, agreed on in advance, saves lives on both sides of a fight that doesn't have to happen at all. It's a strange thought to sit with on a quiet night, that some of the same instincts governing how modern armies and modern negotiators try to avoid unnecessary bloodshed were already in rougher form, flying from the mastheads of ships nobody at the time would have called anything but criminal. What should stay with you about Robert's flag, more than the grim arithmetic of the trial that followed it, is the strange intimacy of the thing. A man took a personal grievance, two colonial governments that had specifically tried to kill him, and turned it into a piece of cloth, run up a mast for strangers he'd never met to read and understand instantly, without a single word passing between them. It's a kind of communication that has almost no modern equivalent. Not quite a threat, not quite a declaration, closer to a message sent across an ocean in the hope that the right people someday would see it and understand exactly who had sent it and why. Two colonial governments did see it. They sent a warship in answer, and on a February morning off Cape Lopez, the conversation that flag had started for however many months it flew ended definitively in grape shot, and a body committed to the sea in a crimson waistcoat, rather than left for anyone else to claim. It is, in its own violent way, one of the more human details to survive from this entire era, a man arguing with two governments through nothing but cloth and thread, and very nearly winning the argument for 2 full years before he didn't. That same instinct, governing violence through a shared, agreed-upon signal rather than leaving every encounter to raw, unpredictable chaos, shows up one more time in this story. In a much quieter setting, the moment a man broke that system's rules not against an enemy, but against his own shipmates. The smell hits you first, again the way it always does on mornings like this one, powder smoke, thick and acrid, this time mixed with a copper tang of blood not entirely washed from the deck after a hard-fought engagement against a well-armed Spanish guardacosta an hour before dawn. The fight is over now. Finally, your side won. Barely. At the cost of 3 men wounded badly enough to matter, and 1 dead outright. What happens now as the adrenaline slowly drains out of you and your hands start to shake with the delayed aftermath every man aboard has long since learned to expect, isn't celebration of any kind. It's a muster, every man accounted for, every station checked twice over, and it's during that same careful muster that Silas Rowe notices a name that simply doesn't answer when called. Samuel Price, a forced man taken off a captured merchantman some 4 months back, nowhere at all to be found among the men who actually fought. Price turns up 20 minutes later, found by 2 crewmen sent below specifically to search the hold, curled behind a stack of water casks in the lowest, darkest part of the ship, unhurt, unarmed, and unmistakably hiding rather than genuinely lost or trapped. What happens in the next several minutes is the part that surprises you most of all. Watching it unfold from just a few feet away with your own hands still trembling faintly from the fight. Nobody strikes him. Nobody so much as raises a voice much louder than the ordinary business of the deck around them. He's simply escorted, firmly but entirely without violence, up to the open deck and told plainly, by Silas himself, that he'll answer for this properly. A word that, on your old merchant ship, would have meant nothing beyond whatever the captain personally felt like doing to him in that moment. Here, you already know, it means something considerably more specific. The articles you signed months ago, the same documents Silas read aloud your very first night aboard, back when all of this still felt strange and new to you, lay out a genuine graduated scale of offences and penalties, and cowardice in the face of an enemy sits near the more serious end of it, though rarely at the absolute top. Theft from the common stock, striking a crewmate aboard ship without cause, bringing a woman aboard in disguise, each carries its own specified consequence under Roberts's surviving articles and similar documents from other crews of the period, ranging from a docked share to marooning to death for the very worst offences, most commonly reserved for murder of a fellow crewman or a genuinely catastrophic betrayal like deserting to the enemy mid-battle rather than simply failing to fight. Desertion of your post during an active engagement, which is more or less exactly what Price now stands accused of, typically falls somewhere in the harsher but not fatal range of the scale, a serious matter without question. But one the articles anticipate might sometimes stem from genuine panic rather than calculated treachery, and treat, at least in the letter of the law you yourself signed, with real room for exactly that distinction to matter in the end. The hearing itself convenes that same afternoon, on open deck, with the whole crew present, not a select jury, not a closed council of officers, but every man aboard, who isn't still needed at a watch station, gathered in a loose half-circle around Silas, who presides the way he presides over everything, without ceremony, but without hurry either. This is, you're realizing as you watch it unfold, close to the closest thing this ship has to a proper court. Witnesses called, testimony weighed, and a verdict decided not by a single judge's ruling, but by the collective voice of the men who'll have to live with whatever the outcome is, the same basic machinery you watched settle a stolen ring and a dice dispute weeks earlier, now turned towards something considerably graver. Two men who'd fought near Price's assigned station testify first, describing, without obvious malice or exaggeration, that he simply wasn't there when the fighting started in earnest, and that his sudden absence left a genuine gap in the line that another man had to scramble desperately to cover under fire. It's damning testimony, delivered flatly, without embellishment, in a way that somehow makes it land harder than any dramatic accusation could. Price, when it's his turn to speak, doesn't deny being absent. What he offers instead, halting, his voice barely holding steady, is an account of a paralysing fear that had seized him the moment the Guardacosta's first broadside landed close enough to soak the deck with spray. A fear he says he's never fully explained to anyone, going back to a childhood shipwreck that killed his father within sight of land. He hadn't planned to hide. He simply found himself, sometime in the chaos, already hiding and unable to make his legs carry him back up. What follows is the part you genuinely didn't expect at all when this whole process first started that afternoon, real substantive debate, conducted entirely in the open, about whether panic and cowardice are actually the same thing at all, and whether the article's penalty was ever truly meant to fall equally on both in every circumstance. One older hand, a man who's sailed with Silas for years, argues that intent matters, that a man who hides out of calculated self-interest, expecting his shipmates to cover for him while he stays safe, deserves harsher treatment than a man genuinely seized by a fear he couldn't master, however much damage the two failures cause in the moment. Another crewman pushes back hard, arguing that the ship can't afford to make that distinction in practice, that a gap in the line is a gap in the line regardless of the reason behind it, and that leniency here just teaches the next frightened man that fear is an acceptable excuse when cannon fire starts. Both arguments have real weight, and you find yourself, uncomfortably, unable to fully side with either one. The vote that follows isn't unanimous, and Silas doesn't pretend it is, calling for a recount of raised hands once when the first tally looks too close to trust at a glance. What carries, by what looks to you like a solid but not overwhelming majority, is a middle path, Not death, not simple forgiveness, but marooning, not on some distant, deserted spit of sand meant to be a slow death sentence, but on a small inhabited quay near a shipping lane, provisioned with a pistol, a modest measure of powder and shot, and enough water to survive a reasonable wait for another vessel to happen by. It's a genuine punishment, a real severing from the crew and the shares and the protection this whole system has offered you for months, but it stops well short of the harsher fate the articles technically permitted. Price, hearing the verdict, doesn't argue. He nods once, and something in his face suggests he expected considerably worse. 3 days later, the ship makes the quay Silas identified, a low scrap of sand and scrub palm barely large enough to walk across in 20 minutes. Close enough to a regularly used shipping route that a rescue within weeks is genuinely plausible rather than a comforting fiction. You're part of the boat crew that rows Price ashore, and the whole process carries a strange formal solemnity that catches you off guard, his allotted pistol and shot handed over and counted out loud, his water cask checked to make sure it's the full measure the articles specify, rather than whatever a resentful crewman might be tempted to shortchange him. One of the men in the boat, a quiet hand who'd said nothing at all during the hearing itself, presses a small folding knife into Price's palm as he steps onto the sand, not part of the official provision, not sanctioned by anything in the articles, just one frightened man's private, unspoken addition to another frightened man's chances. Nobody comments on it. Nobody's meant to. Marooning, as historians have pieced it together from surviving depositions and captains' accounts across multiple crews of this period, functioned as something closer to pirate law's version of exile than a guaranteed death sentence. Brutal, genuinely dangerous, but calibrated, at least on paper, and at least when the articles were honoured in practice, to leave a real chance of survival rather than certain doom. Some marooned men, per the scattered record that survives, were indeed rescued within weeks by passing vessels, their ordeal becoming a story they carried for the rest of their lives. Others weren't so fortunate, and the record on those men, by the nature of the thing, mostly goes silent. You watch Price grow smaller on the beach as the boat pulls away, standing very still, pistol in hand. And you find yourself thinking about the strange mercy embedded even in a punishment this harsh. A mercy that exists only because a whole crew of men, some of whom lost friends to the very gap in the line his absence created, still chose, by majority vote, to give him a fighting chance rather than none at all. Within a month of leaving Price on that quay, the crew tries a very different case, and the contrast tells you something important about how carefully this system actually calibrated its harshest penalty. A crewman named Halloran is caught, this time with overwhelming and entirely undisputed witness testimony from 3 separate men. Having stabbed a sleeping shipmate over what turns out to be a months-old grudge about an unpaid gambling debt from before either man ever signed these particular articles. There's no debate here about intent versus panic, no genuine ambiguity for the crew to argue over the way there had been with Price's case. Murder of a fellow crewman sits at the absolute top of the article's entire scale of offences, and the hearing when it happens is correspondingly short and grim, testimony heard, guilt essentially uncontested, and a sentence of death carried out, by most crews' custom of this period, either by the same pistol and cutlass dual framework used for lesser disputes, or by a formal execution the crew itself carries out collectively, understood, unlike a naval flogging ordered by a single captain's whim, as the deliberate judgment of the whole body of men who elected the officers presiding over it. You don't watch this one as closely as you watched Price's hearing. Some things you're learning a person is allowed to look away from, even here. What stays with you instead is the shape of the contrast. 2 men, both facing the same crew's justice within weeks of each other, receiving sentences separated by the entire distance between exile and execution, because the system, however blunt its instruments, still made a genuine effort to match the punishment to the specific weight of what each man had actually done. What nobody talks about much in the days after both hearings is the quieter weight of having voted at all, because you did vote. On Price's marooning, one hand raised among dozens, your own small portion of the responsibility for exiling a frightened, grieving man to a scrap of sand and hoping the sea was kind to him. On your old merchant ship, responsibility for a punishment like that would have belonged entirely to the captain, a distant figure you could resent freely without ever examining your own role in anything. Here there's no such distance to hide behind. You help decide Price's fate, the same way you'll help decide the next man's, and the next, for as long as you sail under these articles. It's a heavier kind of belonging than you expected when you signed your name, or made your mark that first night aboard, and you're not entirely sure yet whether it sits easier or harder than the alternative you left behind, back when someone else made every hard decision for you and you never had to carry any part of the weight yourself. There's a version of this same machinery you haven't seen tested yet, and hope you never do. The rule against bringing a woman aboard in disguise, the one flagged all the way back on the night the articles were first read to you. It exists, Silas explains when you ask him about it one quiet evening, not out of any particular hostility toward women themselves, some crews of this era. As the trial record of Anne Bonny and Mary Read demonstrates plainly enough, tolerated women fighting openly among their number without much apparent controversy at all, but out of the same blunt calculation that governs so much else in these articles. Secrecy and favouritism of any kind are corrosive to a crew that depends entirely on shared trust to function and a hidden relationship. Discovered late and badly, has ended more than one ship in mutiny and bloodshed long before any woman was ever involved. The rule isn't really about gender at all. In other words, whatever it might look like on the surface to someone who's never lived under it. It's about the same transparency this whole account keeps returning to, applied to one more corner of shipboard life where secrecy could quietly do more damage than almost anything spoken openly on deck. In daylight, where every man present has a chance to weigh in. There's a practical puzzle sitting underneath all of this that took you weeks to fully appreciate. Most of the men voting on Price's fate, deciding Halloran's, weighing testimony and precedent against each other in genuine debate, couldn't read the very document whose penalties they were interpreting. The articles exist as a single written copy, read aloud at the start of every voyage and referred to from memory the rest of the time, which means the ship's actual justice depends less on any man's ability to consult a page than on a kind of living, collectively held memory of what the rules say and how they've been applied before. Silas and men like him across other crews function as something close to a walking legal record, expected to remember precedent accurately enough that a punishment handed down today roughly matches one handed down for a similar offence months earlier. It's a fragile system in theory, memory drifts, precedent gets misremembered. A popular quartermaster could in principle shade his recollection to favour a friend. In practice, you notice, the same transparency that governs the counting of shares governs this too. Any man who remembers a past case differently than Silas describes it is free to say so, loudly in front of the whole crew, and disputes about precedent get argued out in the open the same way disputes about an indigo shipment's value got argued out weeks earlier. It's an oddly durable form of law for a ship with no library, no clerk, and no building anywhere on Earth it can call a courthouse, carried entirely in the memory of several hundred men who have every incentive to keep that memory honest, because tomorrow's defendant could just as easily be any one of them. By the time your first full year under these articles closes, you've sat through, by a rough count not unlike Davy's habit of counting barrels, 4 more hearings of varying severity, a dispute over a gambling debt settled with dock shares, a second case of desertion that ended, unlike Price's, in acquittal once witnesses confirmed the accused man had in fact been knocked unconscious rather than hiding, and 2 disputes serious enough to end in the pistol and cutlass framework rather than a formal ship's sentence at all. None of them left you entirely comfortable, and you've stopped expecting they ever will. That discomfort, you're starting to think, might be the most honest sign the system is actually working the way it's meant to, a genuine court, however rough its edges, rather than a rubber stamp for whatever the crew already wanted to believe, or a captain's private grudge dressed up as justice the way it would have been on any ship you served before this one. You never do learn what became of Samuel Price, and that unresolved thread bothers you more than you expect it to. The ship moves on to other waters within weeks of leaving him on that quay, chasing other prizes, settling other disputes, and no passing vessel ever brings word back to you of a rescued or a starved man matching his description. Silas tells you, when you ask, that this is simply the nature of marooning as a punishment. The crew that hands it down rarely learns the ending, because learning the ending was never really the point. The point was removing a danger to the ship's cohesion, while leaving open, deliberately, the possibility that the story didn't have to end in a grave. Whether it did or didn't, for Price specifically, is a question the historical record of men like him almost never answers, and you find yourself on quiet watches months later, still turning it over without any hope of a real answer. You think, some nights, of the folding knife pressed into his palm on the beach, and you hope, without much evidence to hope on, that it mattered. What the whole stretch of hearings does leave you with, by the time you've lived through enough of them to finally stop finding the process itself novel, is a strange, hard-won respect for a system you'd have called flatly impossible before you ever signed your own name to it. A crew of several hundred armed, dangerous, frequently coerced men, operating with no government at all, no formal law, no court beyond the very deck they stood on together, and somehow, more often than not, arriving at genuine verdicts that tried, however imperfectly, to weigh intent against consequence, mercy against necessity, the way courts back on land, with all their trained judges and thick written precedent, don't always manage to do either one. It didn't make you safe. Exactly. Not really. Nothing about this life ever really did that, not once. But it made the danger legible, predictable, and governed by rules you'd had a real hand in setting yourself, rather than merely a stranger's distant whim you had no say in at all whatsoever, and that difference, you're only now starting to understand, might be the entire, quiet point of everything you've watched this ship do since the morning you were taken. 4 battles and 2 hearings and 1 small, unremembered kindness on a beach ago. There's one more layer to this whole arrangement that this account hasn't shown you yet. Not what happens aboard a single ship, but what happens when dozens of ships, and thousands of men living by roughly these same rules, all end up sharing the same stretch of coastline at once. Picture the harbour at Nassau, on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, on a summer morning in July of 1718. A small squadron of Royal Navy and armed merchant vessels standing off the entrance, flying the flag of a newly appointed royal governor, while somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pirates, the surviving estimates vary. But all of them describe a genuinely enormous concentration of outlaws for a single small settlement, watched from the shore and from a harbour crowded with their own ships, trying to decide individually and collectively whether the man arriving with a printed copy of the King's pardon in hand represents their salvation or their extinction. This is the story of that place, the closest thing the Golden Age of Piracy ever had to a capital city, and of the morning its brief strange independence effectively ended. Nassau hadn't started out as anyone's plan for a pirate stronghold. It had been a modest English colonial settlement on New Providence Island since the late 17th century, valuable mainly for its deep, well-protected harbour and its position along shipping lanes running through the Bahamas, until a series of French and Spanish raids in the early 1700s, part of the broader War of the Spanish Succession playing out across the Caribbean, left the town largely burned and its formal government essentially abandoned. Into that vacuum, over the following decade, drifted exactly the kind of men this whole account has been describing, privateers thrown out of legitimate work by the same 1713 peace treaty that put Charles Vane on his own path, merchant sailors fed up with starvation wages, forced men who'd decided, once free of the ships that took them, to stay in the trade rather than return to the poverty they'd left. By the mid-1710s, Nassau had become, in the words of the frustrated colonial officials who reported on it back to London, functionally lawless, a harbour with no governor, no working courts, and an estimated pirate population that, at its peak around 1717 and 1718, likely numbered somewhere in the low thousands, a genuinely startling concentration of outlaws for a settlement that small. What made Nassau matter to this account isn't simply that pirates gathered there. It's that the same instinct for shared, negotiated order this account has traced aboard individual ships. The articles, the elected officers, the transparent counting of shares appears to have extended, in looser and less formal ways, to how the pirates of Nassau organised themselves as a community, rather than just a collection of separate crews sharing a harbour by coincidence. The clearest evidence of that shared order comes down to us through the figure of Benjamin Hornigold, one of the earliest and most influential captains to base himself at Nassau, and a man whose career illustrates the town's loose governing structure better than almost any single document could. Hornigold appears, from the scattered accounts that survive, to have functioned as something close to a senior or presiding figure among the captains gathered there in the town's early years, not a governor in any formal sense, and certainly not an authority any individual ship's crew was legally bound to obey, since each ship's own articles and elected officers remained the real seat of power for its own men. But among the captains themselves, meeting informally to divide up patrol areas, coordinate the defence of the harbour against outside threats, and settle disputes between crews before those disputes turned into open warfare between ships that badly needed each other's cooperation to keep the settlement functioning, Hornigold seems to have held a genuine, if entirely informal, kind of first among equals standing. This is where the famous phrase Republic of Pirates, used by modern historians and popular writers to describe Nassau at its peak, earns its keep despite being a later invention, rather than a term the pirates themselves would have recognised. There was no written constitution governing the town the way the articles governed an individual ship. No surviving document anywhere close to Robert's preserved rules applied at the level of the whole settlement. What existed instead was something closer to a loose confederation, a council of captains meeting as needed rather than on any fixed schedule, making collective decisions about matters that affected everyone sharing the harbour, which prizes were fair game, and which merchant houses supplying provisions and gunpowder shouldn't be alienated by overly aggressive raiding. How newly arrived crews should be integrated into the settlement's existing arrangements, and, increasingly through 1717 and 1718, how the growing threat of a serious British response should be handled. Nassau's practical function beyond any governing structure was infrastructure, and it's worth pausing to connect this back to everything this account has already shown you happening aboard individual ships, because none of that shipboard machinery could have run for long without a base like this one supporting it from shore. A ship needed careening periodically, hauled over on a beach to have her hull scraped clean of the weed and barnacles that could slow her enough to turn a chase into a disaster, and Nassau's harbour offered exactly the kind of sheltered, defensible beach that operation required. A crew needed to convert stolen cargo into usable coin, which meant fences and brokers willing to buy captured sugar, cloth and indigo at a discount, and move it into legitimate markets through channels that asked few questions, and Nassau, by the mid-1710s, had developed exactly that kind of merchant infrastructure. Corrupt colonial officials and opportunistic traders alike, drawn to a town where an enormous, cash-rich, question-averse population of pirates represented a genuinely lucrative market. And a crew needed, every so often, simply a place to spend money, drink and recover from months at sea among people who understood exactly what that life demanded. The town's taverns, by every account that survives, did a roaring trade throughout this period. Cuff's rum and rationing habits aboard ship, finding their onshore counterpart in establishments that, however disreputable, kept an entire local economy running. It's worth being honest too about how thin that infrastructure actually was compared to a real functioning colony. Nassau in these years had no reliable food production of its own to speak of, depended almost entirely on captured or purchased provisions shipped in from elsewhere, and offered nothing resembling the kind of formal legal protection or civic institution a proper English town would have taken for granted. It worked, to the extent it worked at all, because several thousand armed and desperate men shared enough common interest in keeping the harbour functional that the alternative, total anarchy, ship preying on ship within the same crowded waters, served nobody. The same underlying logic this whole account keeps returning to, scaled up from a single deck to an entire settlement. By 1717, that fragile equilibrium had become impossible to ignore from London's side of the Atlantic. Reports flooding into the Admiralty and the Board of Trade described a Bahamas essentially lost to piracy, shipping losses across the Caribbean and the American coast mounting to a degree that genuinely threatened colonial trade, and a settlement at Nassau operating as an open, undisguised haven for men the Crown had spent years trying to hang individually with limited success. The response, when it came, was uncharacteristically pragmatic for an 18th century government not generally known for leniency toward criminals. Rather than simply dispatching an overwhelming naval force to burn Nassau to the waterline, King George I issued, in September of 1717, a formal proclamation offering a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered and abandoned the trade before a set deadline. An act of amnesty aimed less at moral rehabilitation than at the coldly practical recognition that hanging every pirate in the Bahamas one at a time would take decades the Crown's shipping losses couldn't afford to wait out. To enforce the offer and re-establish formal government over the Bahamas, the Crown appointed Woodes Rogers, himself a former privateer with genuine credentials in this world, having led a famous circumnavigating privateering voyage a few years earlier that, among other things, had rescued the marooned Scottish sailor Alexander Selkirk, whose ordeal partly inspired Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. As the first royal governor of the newly reasserted colony, Rogers arrived off Nassau in July of 1718 with a small squadron, a printed copy of the pardon, and a genuinely difficult task ahead of him, convincing a settlement of well-armed men who had, in Hornigold and others, functioning leadership structures of their own, that surrendering a life that had made many of them genuinely wealthy was actually in their own interest. The morning Rogers actually arrived in the harbour plays out, according to the accounts that survive. Less like a military conquest than like a tense, high-stakes negotiation conducted at gunpoint by both sides simultaneously. Rogers' own squadron was modest, nowhere near strong enough to overwhelm the sheer number of pirates and pirate vessels crowded into Nassau's harbour by force, a fact both sides understood perfectly well. What Rogers actually had to offer was the pardon itself, backed by the implicit threat of the much larger naval response that would inevitably follow if the offer was refused. And it's a measure of how genuinely exhausted many of the pirates were, with a life that for all its internal fairness still carried a constant risk of violent death, that a substantial number of Nassau's pirates, Hornigold himself prominent among them, accepted the pardon essentially on the spot, formally submitting to Rogers' authority within days of his arrival. Not everyone did. Charles Vane, the same captain whose deposition by his own crew over a decision to flee rather than fight a French warship, this account examined in detail several chapters ago, refused the pardon outright, and his refusal produced one of the more theatrically defiant moments to survive from this entire period. Rather than surrender quietly, Vane, according to multiple accounts, loaded a captured prize ship with combustible material, set it ablaze, and sent it drifting directly into the anchored ships of Rogers' own squadron as a floating fireship, creating enough chaos and forced manoeuvring that he was able to sail his own vessel directly out of the harbour past Rogers' fleet, flying full pirate colours and, by some accounts, firing a parting shot of open defiance as he went. It's a scene almost too cinematic to be believed, and yet it rests on reasonably consistent testimony across multiple period sources rather than resting solely on Johnson's more dramatised general history, a genuine, documented act of one man choosing continued outlawry, eyes open, over the safety Hornigold and hundreds of others had just accepted. Vane's escape didn't save the republic he'd left behind, and within it lies the real turning point of this whole story. Rogers spent the following months consolidating control over Nassau itself, rebuilding the town's defences, establishing an actual functioning court and garrison, and working to convert some of the pardoned pirates, Hornigold among them, into privateers and pirate hunters in the Crown's own service, a genuinely uncomfortable but pragmatic use of exactly the ship handling and combat skill that had made these men dangerous outlaws in the first place. It's a strange, quiet coda to Hornigold's story specifically, a man who had, by most accounts, functioned as something close to a governing figure among Nassau's pirate captains, ending his career instead hunting down former colleagues on the Crown's payroll, his practical talent for organising men and resources simply redirected rather than extinguished. The pirates who refused the pardon and stayed active, Vane among the most prominent, though certainly not the only holdout, found themselves, over the following 2 to 3 years, increasingly without the infrastructure this chapter has spent so much time describing. No more sheltered Nassau harbour to careen in without fear of a naval ambush. No more easily accessible fences and brokers operating in the open. No more informal council of fellow captains to coordinate patrol areas or defend the settlement collectively against outside threats. Each remaining pirate crew was thrown back onto exactly the kind of isolated, self-reliant existence this whole account described in its earliest chapters: the articles, the elected quartermaster, the internal fairness. But without the larger supporting network that had, for a few remarkable years, let hundreds of separate crews function as something closer to a genuine, if entirely illegal, society, Vane himself, as this account already covered, was wrecked, captured, and hanged within about 2.5 years of that dramatic escape. Blackbeard, who had also spent time among Nassau's early pirate community before striking out on his own increasingly notorious career, was killed in a bloody boarding action off North Carolina in November of 1718. Mere months after Roger's arrival, a death violent and quick enough that it left no room for any deposition, hearing, or vote of the kind this account has spent so long describing. What Nassau's rise and fall reveals, set against everything else this account has shown you about how a single pirate ship actually ran itself, is that the fairness and function this whole story keeps returning to was never quite as self-contained as it might have looked from inside a single ship's articles. Bartholomew Roberts, whose career this account traced across an earlier chapter, operated for most of his most successful years after Nassau's fall, working the West African coast far from any equivalent pirate haven, proof that the internal machinery of a single ship's articles, quartermaster and elected officers could indeed function well on its own, without a Nassau to support it. But it's worth noticing too that Roberts's operation, remarkable as it was, existed increasingly as an isolated exception rather than part of a thriving network, hunted more single-mindedly and eventually run down by a Royal Navy that no longer had to worry about an entire fortified pirate settlement absorbing and rearming every crew it damaged. Nassau's fall didn't end piracy immediately, but it removed the collective scaffolding that had let piracy operate. For a few remarkable years between roughly 1715 and 1718, at something closer to an industrial scale than a scattered handful of opportunistic raiders. The phrase Republic of Pirates itself, coined well after the fact by later historians rather than by the men who lived through it, captures something real about the ambition of what Nassau briefly became, while also risking overstating its formality. There was no pirate parliament, no written constitution, no elected head of state in any sense a modern reader would recognise. What there was instead was the same instinct this whole account has traced from a single ship's articles all the way up to an entire settlement's loose council of captains, a group of men with every reason to distrust formal authority, and every practical need to build some working substitute for it anyway, arriving again and again at remarkably similar answers: shared risk, negotiated rules. Leadership earned rather than inherited, and accountability that ran, however imperfectly, in more than one direction at once. The numbers behind Roger's pardon offer a useful, concrete sense of just how large this exodus actually was, and how thoroughly it reshaped the pirate world this whole account has been describing. Contemporary reports suggest that several hundred pirates took the pardon within the first weeks and months of Roger's arrival, a substantial fraction of Nassau's total population, even accounting for the genuine uncertainty in any period estimate of a population that never sat still long enough to be properly counted. Some of those pardoned men, predictably, drifted back into piracy within a year or two once the promised economic opportunities Rogers dangled, land grants, legitimate trade, privateering commissions, failed to materialise as generously as advertised, a pattern colonial administrators of the era complained about with some regularity. But the settlement itself never recovered its former role as a functioning, semi-organised pirate capital. Rogers' garrison, however undermanned and underfunded by his own frequent complaints to London, was enough to prevent Nassau from ever again hosting the kind of open, 1,000-strong pirate population it had sheltered at its peak. The individual fates of the men this account has already introduced trace the same larger pattern from different angles. Hornigold spent his final years as a Crown-commissioned pirate hunter, reportedly dying in a shipwreck around 1719, a considerably quieter end than most of his former colleagues managed, and one that lets his story close on cooperation rather than the gallows. Vane's defiant escape bought him roughly 2.5 more years of freedom before the fate this account has already described caught up with him at gallows point. And within 4 years of that morning in Nassau's harbour, Bartholomew Roberts, who had never called Nassau home at all, having come to piracy considerably later and operated almost entirely along the West African coast, was dead too, his flag with its 2 initialed skulls finally answered by exactly the kind of naval force Nassau's fall had freed up to go looking for him. There's a final, quieter piece of Nassau's legacy worth sitting with before this story lets you go, the sheer improbability of any of it having worked at all, even briefly. Several thousand men, most of them poor, many of them forced into this life rather than choosing it freely, virtually all of them operating entirely outside any legal system that would have protected their persons or their property, built, not through any single leader's grand design, but through the same slow, repeated, ship-by-ship trial and error this whole account has traced from Roberts' articles to Vane's deposition to Price's hearing on that beach, something that functioned, for a few remarkable years, recognisably like a society. Not a fair one by modern standards, and not a peaceful one. It ran on stolen goods and, in its ugliest moments, on human beings valued as cargo alongside the sugar and the silver, but a society all the same, one with rules its members mostly followed, leadership its members mostly chose, and a rough, hard-won sense of mutual obligation that bound together men who had, in most cases, never met each other before circumstance or coercion threw them onto the same deck. That's the real answer to the question this whole account set out to explore: how a pirate crew was actually organised, and why the honest answer looks so little like the version handed down through 3 centuries of legend and film. It wasn't chaos with a skull and crossbones flag flown over it for atmosphere. It was, again and again, on ship after ship, and eventually across an entire settlement. Ordinary men building the most functional system of fairness and accountability available to them anywhere in their world, not despite being criminals with nothing left to lose, but in some strange way because of it, because no king, no company, no distant court was ever going to build that fairness for them, and they'd learned, the hard way, that the alternative to building it themselves was simply not to have it at all. Somewhere back at the start of tonight's journey, before Nassau and its council of captains, before Samuel Price on his beach and Davy counting his barrels, before Roberts ever stitched 2 skulls and 2 islands' initials onto a length of black cloth, this whole account opened on a simple claim that a pirate crew could vote out its own captain before lunch, and that losing an eye was worth more, in cold hard coin, than losing a toe. That wasn't a curiosity. It was the whole shape of the thing, told small. Behind every one of those details sat the same quiet machinery, article signed by firelight, a quartermaster counting coin in the open air. A crew arguing itself toward a verdict rather than accepting one handed down from above. Men with every reason in the world to trust no one built. Instead, something worth trusting, out of nothing but ink, a raised hand, and the plain fact that they needed each other to survive the next storm, the next broadside, the next long night at anchor. Most of them didn't survive it. In the end, the gallows at Wapping and Cape Coast Castle and Gallows Point took more of this story's names than any storm ever did. But for the years it lasted, several hundred men who owed nothing to king or company built, out on the water, a fairer accounting of a man's worth than most of the world back on land ever offered them. That's worth remembering the next time a skull and crossbones shows up on a birthday cake or a beach towel, stripped of everything it actually stood for. You're warm tonight. You're dry. You're not counting barrels under your breath, waiting for a vote that decides whether you keep your share, your captain, or your life. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. Rest now. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.